Imagine being born in Persia, on dusty streets where poets recited under pomegranate trees, and the scent of saffron clung to the air at dawn. Persia, the land of turquoise domes and quiet courtyards, though not so peaceful now. And from there, the Silk Road. It didn't have that name then, of course, stretched westward like a promise, across mountains and deserts towards Baghdad. They told tales and become legend. The Arabian Nights as we packed our bags. Of Sinbad, who overcame his fears. Of merchants who found treasures and curses alike. They said Baghdad was a city of gold, where the Silk Road found its glittering heart, where the Tigris River carried whispers of poetry and trade beneath its minarets. Yet even as we dreamed of riches, there was tension in the air, of shifting borders, of powers watching, of roadblocks and bribes demanded at night. The Silk Road was never all about silk. It was about risk, sweat, and the quiet knowledge that a blade might glint in the dark. Yet I chose to follow it, to see Baghdad unfold before me, chasing a mirage that smelled of cinnamon and dust. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And now, let's begin the journey to the Promised Land. Chapter 1, The Long Road of Dreams and Dust. They did not call it the Silk Road then. It was simply the road or the trade path or the caravan route, winding its way across deserts and mountains, rivers and steppes, carrying merchants, spices, stories, and hopes between the lands of sunrise and the lands of sunset. I remember the morning we left Samarkand, before the call to prayer, before the market awoke, when the city still held its breath in the soft darkness before dawn. Samarkand, the city of blue domes and fragrant gardens, lay quiet under the fading stars, the tile minarets catching the first hint of gray in the sky. The air was cool, carrying the scent of baked clay and the lingering sweetness of last night's bread. In the alleys, cats slinked past shuttered shops, the stones beneath my sandals cold as I stepped softly, so as not to disturb the silence that felt like a prayer. We called it Persia then, though some would one day call it Iran, a land of gardens hidden behind high mud brick walls, of verses whispered under pomegranate trees, of tea poured slowly into small clay cups, steaming in the cool morning air. But I was leaving it behind, chasing a promise that hummed in every breath. Baghdad, they said, was a city of wonders, where the minarets shone like spears of gold at sunrise, where the river Tigris flowed with the breath of poets, where scholars debated in courtyards while merchants counted coins beneath lantern light. They said it was a city where dreams became silk and silk became gold. But they also spoke in hushed voices about the harshness of the journey, about the sands that could swallow a man's footprints by noon, about the mountains that tore the wind into icy knives, about the thieves who waited beyond the glow of the campfire, and about the sickness that came quietly in the night, stealing the strength from a man's limbs as easily as a thief slipped a dagger from his belt. I checked the loads once more before dawn, my hands running over tight ropes that bound the silks I carried, dyed in colors deep as the twilight sky, soft as a promise, heavy with the hopes of my family. They smelled faintly of mulberry leaves and the smoke of the dyer's fires. Each bolt was worth more than I would earn in a season, and each bolt was a weight I would carry in my heart every step toward Baghdad. Our caravan was small, 5 camels, 3 men, each of us bound together by the silent agreement that we would share the road, share the water, share the watch of the darkness, and share the fear that pressed into our chests when the wind howled across the dunes at night. The old man leading us was quiet, his beard gray and long, his eyes dark and sharp as obsidian. He had walked these paths many times, and when he spoke, it was only to say what was necessary. Tie the loads tighter, he would say, or walk softly here. The sand hides sharp stones. Or, as he looked at the horizon when the sky met the earth, we will stop when the sun touches that place. As we passed through the gates of Samarkand, the guards nodded, their spears resting against their shoulders, their eyes half closed with sleep. A beggar lifted a hand, his voice a whisper asking for a coin, and I dropped a small copper into his palm, the metal cold against his warm skin. In return, he touched his fingers to his lips, then to his forehead, a silent blessing for the road ahead. Outside the walls, the world opened wide, and the road stretched ahead, a pale ribbon of dust leading west toward the unknown. The camels moved slowly, each step deliberate, each breath a soft cloud in the morning chill, the small bells on their harnesses chiming softly, a song for the dawn. The first light touched the tops of the distant mountains, painting them in shades of pink and gold, a promise of warmth to come. The air smelled of dust and dry grass, of the faint scent of animals and the sweat that already began to form beneath the folds of my robe as I walked beside my camel, my hand resting lightly on the worn leather of its pack. As the sun climbed, the world grew warmer, the shadows shrinking until they hid beneath the camels' bellies, the light reflecting from the sand in a blinding shimmer. The road was silent, but for the soft padding of the camels' feet and the occasional call of a hawk circling above, its cry echoing across the emptiness. I thought of Baghdad often, imagining its streets filled with the colors of spices, red peppers, golden saffron, deep brown cinnamon, imagining the soft rustle of silks under the hands of buyers in the markets, the sound of coins clinking, the murmur of voices speaking Arabic, Persian, and Turkic as merchants barter in the cool shade of awnings. I imagined a river, wide and slow, its surface catching the reflection of minarets and the flight of birds, the call to prayer rolling softly across the water. But these were dreams, and the road was real. Each step was a reminder of the distance, of the weight of the goods on the camels' backs, of the thirst that would come when the water skins grew light, of the long hours beneath the sun, and the longer hours in the cold of the desert nights. At night, we stopped where the ground was flat, and where a few scraggly bushes promised some shelter from the wind. We built small fires, careful to keep the flames low, the smoke hidden so it would not guide unwanted eyes to our camp. The tea boiled in a small iron pot, the steam rising into the cold air, carrying the scent of mint and the warmth of home into the vast, indifferent darkness. It was in these nights that the stories returned. Stories carried along these paths for generations. Stories older than the roads themselves, older than the empires that rose and fell like waves in the desert. Stories of the Arabian Nights, of Sinbad who braved seas darker than the deserts, of Ali Baba, who found a cave filled with gold but also with danger, of hidden cities where fountains whispered under the shade of date palms, where carpets flew through the air, and where a poor man might find a lamb that would change his fate forever. These stories were more than entertainment. They were a kind of prayer, a way to push back the fear that came when the wind rose and the darkness pressed close. They were reminders that fortunes could be found, that cleverness could defeat cruelty, that hope could light even the darkest path. They were reminders of why we walked, why we carried silk across deserts, why we left behind the safety of Samarkand's walls. When dawn returned, we would pack again, the camels rising with soft grunts, shaking the sleep from their long limbs, the bells on their harnesses chiming softly as they shifted under their loads. The fire's last embers would glow in the sand before fading, leaving nothing but a dark mark that the wind would soon erase. And so we walked, following the ancient paths westward, following the dreams of Baghdad, following the stories that live in our hearts, on a road that had no name then, but that carried with it the hopes of those who dare to leave the comfort of home in search of something more. We did not call it the Silk Road. It was simply the road we walked, the road that tested our patience and our courage, the road that held the promise of Baghdad in its long, dusty breath. They say that on the long road to Baghdad, a merchant learns to measure time not by hours, but by heat and cold, by the hush of dawn, the burn of midday, and the sharp breath of nightfall when the stars arrive. In the early mornings, when we first rose from our blankets, the air was soft and cool, carrying the scent of dry earth, of crushed grass, of the camels shifting slowly as they stood, bells on their harnesses chiming softly like distant wind chimes. The sky was pale, almost silver, and the road ahead seemed kind, stretching quietly into the waking light. We moved carefully in those hours, savoring the softness of the air before the sun began its climb. Our feet pressed patterns into the dust, the camels padded steps leaving broad prints that the breeze would soon soften. We listened to the wind, to the breath of the camels, to the quiet rustle of robes. Our voices were low, our conversations measured, for we saved our energy, knowing what the day would bring. As the sun rose higher, the world changed. The breeze faded, leaving the air still and heavy, pressing down on our shoulders, sliding heat along our spines until the sweat soaked into our clothes and dried again in the same breath, leaving the taste of salt on our lips. The sand began to glow, reflecting the sunlight in sharp flashes that made us squint even under the folds of our head coverings. The world smelled of warm dust, of the musky scent of camels, of the leather of water skins, of the faint, dry perfume of the desert. The heat was a presence that demanded respect, making every movement deliberate, turning each step into a small act of will. Even the camels, patient and enduring, grew restless under the weight of the sun, turned their heads to look at us with long, blinking eyes as if asking why we continued forward when the world itself begged us to rest. But the road westward would not wait, and Baghdad was still far beyond the horizon. So we walked, counting our steps, sipping water carefully from our flasks, letting it sit on our tongues before swallowing. The coolness of small mercy in the burning light. Each drop was precious, a promise that we would see another dawn, that we would one day see the Tigris glinting beneath Baghdad's minarets. At midday, when the shadows disappeared, we would stop, finding what shade we could beneath a twisted tree or a ledge of stone. The shade was thin, but it was enough to ease the burn of the sun, to let us rest, to breathe without the weight pressing on our chests. We would share a few dates, their sweetness sharp and welcome, and sometimes a piece of flatbread, dry but filling, reminding us of the homes we had left behind. In those still moments, I would close my eyes and think of Baghdad, letting the vision of its markets fill my mind, the colors of saffron and turmeric, the smell of roasting meats and sweet pastries, the cool splash of water in fountains hidden in courtyards, the laughter of children running between stalls, the calm voices of merchants, and the gentle rustle of silk being unfolded for inspection. I imagined the scholars in the madrasas, their voices rising and falling as they recited verses and discussed the stars, and the poets in tea houses, sharing lines that moved like music through the air. But the day would not wait forever, and as the heat began to soften, we would rise again, stretching sore limbs, tightening the ropes around the goods and the camels, brushing off the dust that clung to our robes. The air would shift, a breeze returning, playful now, carrying the scent of distant flowers that grew where water found hidden paths beneath the sand. As the sun sank, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the desert transformed once more. The heat would lift, leaving behind a lingering warmth that slowly faded as the light dimmed, replaced by a chill that crept across the ground and settled in our bones. The sand, so hot only hours before, would cool under our feet, and the first stars would appear, sharp and bright, in the darkening sky. We would stop to make camp, choosing a place with clear views in all directions, wary of what the night could bring. The camels would kneel with soft groans, their bodies shifting as they folded their legs beneath them, the bells on their harnesses jingling softly before settling into silence. We would unpack carefully, checking the loads, ensuring that the silk remained dry, the spices secure, for the desert's cold could bring dew that would ruin what we carried. A small fire would be lit, just enough to warm our hands, to heat water for tea, to bring light to the faces of those around it. The flames flickered, casting shadows that danced across the sand, the smoke rising in a thin, fragrant line that disappeared into the darkness above. The scent of mint and tea leaves would drift in the cold air, comforting in its familiarity, a small reminder of home. At night, the desert was vast and silent, the quiet so deep that the crackle of the fire seemed loud, the breath of the camels like soft sighs, the shifting of sand under our feet like whispers. We would pull our robes tighter, leaning close to the warmth, watching the stars, letting the cold sharpen our senses even as it pulled us toward sleep. It was in these nights that stories returned, as they always did on the road. Stories of Sinbad's journeys across dark seas, stories of Ali Baba and hidden caves, stories of magical carpets and lost cities where fountains ran with rose water and lanterns glowed in gardens under the moon. Stories of Baghdad, where the Tigris reflected the lantern lights, where the call to prayer rolled over the water in the dawn, where a merchant could find wealth or ruin or something in between. These stories were not just to pass the time. They were reminders of why we walked, why we endured the heat of the day and the cold of the night, why we followed the road even when it seemed endless. They were reminders that somewhere beyond the darkness, beyond the long days and the hard ground, Baghdad waited, its gates open, its markets alive, its river flowing under the watchful stars. And so, as the fire burned low and the wind whispered across the dunes, we would close our eyes, letting the stories become dreams, letting the dreams carry us into sleep, ready to rise again when the dawn returned, when the world was cool once more, when the road called us forward toward Baghdad, under breath of morning, with the promise of another day on a long road of dreams and dust. The road to Baghdad teaches a merchant the rhythm of patience. It is a rhythm of caravan bells, the slow sway of camels, the steady crunch of sand in the sandals, the hush of dawn, the burn of midday, and the sigh of wind under the stars. It is a rhythm that hums beneath every heartbeat, reminding you that the road is long, that wealth is slow, and that danger can arrive as silently as dawn. Each morning, before the first colors of sunrise touch the horizon, we would rise. The embers of the night's fire would glow softly, a single thread of smoke drifting into the pale sky. The camels would groan softly as they stood, the bells tied to their harnesses chiming in the silence, announcing the start of another day. The ropes were checked, the loads adjusted, the water skins tied carefully, and with quiet words, the caravan would begin to move, a line of shifting shapes in the dawn. The pace was steady, never hurried. Camels walk as if they know the way of the desert, as if they understand that haste can lead to death. That patience is the price of survival. Their heads swayed gently, their feet pressing soft prints into sand, each step a quiet thud in the dry air. We walked beside them or behind them, our eyes watching the road ahead, the sky, the shapes on the horizon, always listening to the sounds around us, the wind, the shifting sand, the breathing of the animals. There is a comfort in this rhythm, a simplicity that quiets the mind. The road asks nothing but your patience, and in return, it teaches you to measure time in steps and sunrises, to find peace in the silence between the bells, in the breath of the wind that carries the scent of warm earth and distant water. But the rhythm of the road was shadowed by the whispers of danger that traveled with us. We knew that bandits waited, that somewhere beyond the next ridge or hidden behind the dunes, there could be eyes watching, waiting for the moment when our guard dropped, when the camel strayed too far, when the fire burned too bright in the night. At every stop, the older merchants would remind us, stay close to the caravan, watch the water skins, check the ropes before dawn. Their voices were calm, but their eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon, noting every shape, every movement, every shadow that flickered in the distance. The stories we heard at night were not only of Sinbad's treasures and Baghdad's golden markets. They were also stories of caravans lost, of camels taken, of goods stolen under the moonlight, of men who vanished into the desert, leaving only footprints that the wind would soon cover. Sometimes we would pass the remnants of such stories. A broken cart wheel half buried in the sand, the bones of a camel whitened by the sun, the scraps of cloth tangled in a thorn bush, fluttering in the wind like a ghost of the past. Each reminder was silent, but it spoke loudly in our minds, reminding us that the road to Baghdad was not a promise. It was a gamble. We adjusted our travel to the dangers we could not see. During the day, we kept close, the camels tied together with ropes, the goods secured, the water carefully rationed. We watched the horizon, looking for dust that might signal riders approaching, for glints of metal that might betray a blade. We listened for the sounds of hooves, for the sudden hush of birds taking flight, for the silence that sometimes falls before danger arrives. At night, the camp was made with care. The camels were brought close, their ropes tied to stakes and ground. The goods arranged in a circle to create a small wall. The fire kept low to avoid drawing eyes from the darkness beyond. Watches were set, each man taking his turn to sit by the fire, eyes scanning the darkness, ears tuned to every rustle, every shift of the wind. The stars above seemed so close in the desert night, their light cold and clear, watching as we sat with our robes pulled around us, blades within reach, hearts steady but alert. The camels would sleep, their breathing slow, the bells on their harnesses chiming softly when they shifted, a reminder of the rhythm that continued even in the quiet hours. And yet, in the midst of this caution, there was still the comfort of the road, the gentle sway of the camels, the whisper of the sand, the soft glow of the fire. We learned to live with the fear, to let it become a part of the rhythm, a thread woven into the fabric of the journey, reminding us to be careful, but not stopping us from moving forward. There were moments of tension, times when we saw dust rising in the distance and paused, tightening the ropes, gathering the camels, watching as the shapes approached, hearts beating faster. Sometimes it was another caravan, and we would greet each other with careful smiles, exchanging news of the road, warnings of dry wells, of storms, of bandits seen near certain passes. Other times, the shapes would circle, watching us, and we would prepare ourselves, hands resting on the hilts of blades, eyes steady, breath slow. And then, as suddenly as they appeared, they would turn away, vanishing into the dunes, leaving us with the quickened rhythm of our hearts, the taste of fear sharp in our mouths, the silence returning once more. The road to Baghdad was not just a path of sand and dust. It was a path of patience and caution, of dreams held tightly in the heart, of the quiet understanding that wealth was not easily won, that every coin earned in the markets of Baghdad was matched by the risk taken under the cold gaze of the stars. And so we continued, day after day, following the rhythm of the caravan, letting the bells guide our steps, letting the stories of Baghdad guide our dreams, moving carefully, patiently, steadily toward a city that waited beyond the dunes, beyond the mountains, beyond the dangers that walked quietly in the shadows of the road. We walked because we believed that Baghdad was worth the journey, that the spices we carried, the silk we protected, the dreams we held were worth the risk, that the stories of the Arabian Nights were not just tales for children, but promises whispered on the wind, promises that somewhere, under the golden domes of Baghdad, we would find a wealth and peace that the road had taught us to cherish. And so the bells chimed, the camels swayed, the sand whispered beneath our feet, and the road carried us forward, one careful step at a time, through the rhythm of days and the watchful quiet of nights, toward the city that lay waiting, the city we called Baghdad. At night, when the cold of the desert settled into the sand and crept up through our blankets, when the wind slowed to a soft hush and the stars opened above us like small lanterns in the endless dark, that was when the stories returned. The fire would burn low, a small circle of light and warmth in the vastness of the desert, crackling softly as thin twigs surrendered to the flames. We would sit close, robes pulled tight, hands held near the glow to gather the warmth before it slipped away into the cold. The camels lay beyond the fire, dark shapes resting in the sand, the bells on their harnesses chiming softly when they shifted, reminding us that the world was still there, that the road still waited, even in the quietest hours. It was in these moments that the merchants, who were quiet and watchful during the day, found their voices again. Their words rose softly with the smoke, drifting into the darkness, carried by the same wind that moved the dunes and whispered through the dry bushes. They spoke not of threats that lay hidden in the shadows or the bandits who might be watching from beyond the reach of the firelight, but of dreams of Baghdad, of stories as old as the road itself. They told of Sinbad, the sailor who braved seas as wide and dangerous as the deserts we crossed, who found islands where diamonds lay in riverbeds, where giant birds soared to the sky, where wonders and terrors walked side by side. They spoke of Sinbad's cleverness, his courage, his fortune that was not merely gold, but the strength to keep moving, to keep believing that beyond each hardship was a new dawn, a new chance to live, to trade, to see the world's wonders. They told of Ali Baba, who discovered a cave filled with treasures beyond count, a cave that opened to a single phrase and held the promise of wealth that could change a man's life. But they also spoke of the dangers that wealth brought, of the thieves who guarded their gold with sharp blades, of the greed that could turn fortune into ruin, of the need to be wise, to be careful, to know that riches often came with a price hidden beneath their glitter. There were stories of Baghdad itself, stories of a city that we all carried in our hearts as we walked, stories of its markets, where silks from China and spices from India met in the hands of merchants, where gold coins changed hands beneath awnings that shaded the streets from the sun, stories of the river Tigris, flowing quietly past gardens where pomegranate trees bent low with fruit, where lanterns reflected in the water at night, their light moving with the current like small drifting stars. They spoke of the scholars of Baghdad, who studied under the glow of oil lamps, reading books carried across the same roads we walked, discussing the movements of the stars, the secrets of medicine, the verses of poets. They spoke of poets reciting lines in tea houses, their words floating into the warm air, mixing with the scent of mint tea and sweet pastries, of musicians whose instruments echoed softly through courtyards lit with lanterns. Each story was a promise, a reminder of why we endured the heat of the day and the cold of night, why we guarded our goods so carefully, why we walked even when our feet ached and our eyes longed for sleep. The stories were more than entertainment. They were comfort. They were hope. They were the reason we kept going, one step after another, on the long road that led us to Baghdad. Sometimes, the stories were personal. An old merchant would speak of the first time he saw Baghdad, of the moment the golden domes appeared on the horizon, catching the morning light, glowing like a promise kept. He would speak of the first coin he earned there, of the first boat of silk he sold, of the taste of the bread fresh from the ovens in the market, of the sound of the call to prayer rolling over the rooftops at dawn. His voice would soften, his eyes reflecting the firelight, the memory warm even in the cold desert night. Others spoke of losses, of goods stolen on the road, of storms that swallowed caravans and waves of sand, of companions who fell sick and could not rise again, of dreams that were buried beneath the dunes. Yet even in these stories, there was no bitterness, only the quiet acceptance of the road's lessons, the understanding that the journey was as important as the destination, that each step was a part of the story, that even hardship could not erase the hope of seeing Baghdad again. As the stories wove through the cold air, we would sit quietly, listening, letting the words fill the spaces between the crackle of the fire and the soft sigh of the wind. We could almost see the markets, almost hear the murmur of voices, almost smell the spices in the air, feel the silk under our hands, the coins in our palms. We could almost taste the tea, sweet and warm, under the shade of Baghdad's awnings, the city alive around us. And in those moments, the dangers of the road faded. The distance between us and Baghdad grew smaller. The cold of the night became softer, and the fear that sometimes crept into our hearts was replaced by a quiet, steady hope. The stories reminded us of why we walked, why we endured, why we followed the rhythm of the caravan bells and the slow sway of the camels, why we rose before dawn and moved through the heat of the day. They reminded us that Baghdad was not just a place on a map, but a dream carried in the heart, a promise whispered in the darkness, a story waiting to be lived. It was a city we all hoped to see, the place where the silk we guarded would unfold in the light, where the spices would spill their scents into the air, where the coins would clink softly into our hands, where the stories would continue, told under the same stars that watched us on the road. As the fire burned lower and the last sparks drifted into the cold night, we would wrap ourselves in our blankets, pulling them tight, letting the warmth of the stories linger as we closed our eyes. The camels would shift and settle, the bells on their harnesses giving a last soft chime before silence returned. The wind would move softly across the sand, carried with the promise of dawn, the promise of another day on the road to Baghdad, the promise of stories yet to be told, dreams yet to be lived, under the endless stars that marked our path westward, toward the city of gold. There is a moment on every long journey when you begin to sense that the road is ending, that the horizon is drawing closer, that the dust of many days is about to give way to something new. It is not a sudden moment, but a slow, quiet realization, felt in the way the air changes, in the way the wind carries scents that speak of water and trees, in the way the camels lift their heads as if they, too, can sense the nearness of a destination long dreamed of. For us, it was Baghdad, the city of gold in our stories, the promise whispered in the cold nights by the fire, the place where silk would become coin, where spices would spill their fragrance into the air, where the river would reflect the lantern lights at night and the call to prayer at dawn. We had carried Baghdad in our hearts for so long that the idea of truly arriving felt unreal, like a story told too many times to remain only a story. As we approached, the land began to change. The endless dunes softened, giving way to stretches of dry grass that moved in the breeze, to groves of date palms rising like green promises against the pale sky, to fields where farmers guided plows behind oxen, turning the earth under the watchful eyes of birds waiting to swoop down for insects. The air smelled different, of warm soil, of water hidden beneath the earth, of the sweet heaviness that comes from growing things, a scent that no desert wind could ever carry. We saw more people on the road. Other merchants, travelers, pilgrims, shepherds leading flocks, families moving with all they owned piled high on carts, the wheels creaking in the dust. Greetings were exchanged with small nods, cautious smiles, questions asked in soft voices. How is the road behind you? How many days to Baghdad now? Are the markets as busy as they say? At night, our fires were no longer the only ones dotting the darkness. We saw the glow of other camps, heard the low murmur of conversations, the laughter of children, the soft bleating of sheep, the cough of camels settling for night. The loneliness of the road lessened as we moved closer to the city, replaced by the quiet companionship of others who also carried hopes and goods, who also had walked a long road of dreams and dust. The stories around the fire changed too. They were no longer only of Sinbad's distant seas or Ali Baba's secret cave, but Baghdad itself. Those who had seen it before spoke of the grand libraries where scholars bent over books carried from distant lands, copying texts by the light of oil lamps, sharing ideas that moved like a river through the city. They spoke of the Friday markets, where spices were mounted high in baskets, where sellers called out prices and voices that mixed with the sounds of goats and chickens, where buyers tested silk between their fingers, letting it slip through like water before agreeing on a price. They spoke of the river Tigris, wide and calm, its banks lined with gardens where roses and jasmine grew, where the breeze carried the scent of blossoms across the water, where lanterns hung from trees at night, reflecting in ripples that turned the river into a path of moving light. They spoke of the domes and minarets that caught the sunrise and flashes of gold, of the streets that came alive at dusk when the heat of the day lifted, when people gathered in courtyards and tea houses, when music played softly under the stars. Each story was a promise that the hardships of the road, the heat of the days, the cold of the nights, the fear of bandits, the endless walking, the careful guarding of our goods, all of it was worth the moment when Baghdad would appear on the horizon. And then one morning it did. At first, it was a smudge of color in the distance, a shimmer that seemed to rise from the earth like a mirage. We blinked against the morning light, squinting, wondering if it was only another trick of the desert, another promise that would vanish as we drew closer. But as the sun climbed higher, the smudge became clearer, turning into towers and domes, into minarets reaching toward the sky, into the soft green of trees clustered along the river's edge. The camels seemed to feel it too, their steps quickening, their heads lifting, their ears flicking forward as if they could already hear the sound of the city, smell the water, taste the sweet grass waiting beyond the gates. We felt in our own bodies and the lightness that came to our feet despite the dust, in the way our hearts beat a little faster, in the way we began to speak more, voices rising with excitement, plans to market, for the coins that would soon be in our hands, for the baths that would wash away the weeks of sweat and sand. As we drew closer, the road grew busier. Caravans joined ours, moving in slow lines toward the gates, the sounds of bells and voices blending into a gentle, hopeful hum. We passed gardens where children ran barefoot, calling to each other, their laughter mixing with the rustle of leaves. We smelled bread baking in clay ovens, the warm, yeasty scent drifting across the road, making our mouths water, reminding us of the taste of fresh food, of the meals waiting beyond the walls. And then, at last, we reached the gates. They were tall and wide, carved with patterns that caught the light, guarded by men in robes and turbans, their eyes watchful but not unkind. The gates opened slowly, and as we stepped through, the world changed. The air was filled with new scents, spices, smoke, roasting meats, flowers, and the soft, cool breath of the river. The sound surrounded us, voices in many languages, the calls of merchants, the cries of children, the lowing of cattle, the chiming of bells from camels and donkeys, the soft, rhythmic chant of prayers rising from nearby mosques. The streets were alive with color and movement, with fabrics hanging in shop fronts, catching the breeze in waves of red, blue, and gold, with baskets overflowing with dates and pomegranates, with copper pots glinting in the sunlight, with people moving, talking, trading, living. We moved slowly through it all, leading the camels, our eyes wide, taking the details we had only imagined before. The weight of the journey slipped from our shoulders, replaced by the weight of the moment, by the realization that we had arrived, that the road had led us here, to Baghdad, to the city of stories, to the place where dreams and reality met under the watchful eyes of the minarets and the endless sky. That night, as we settled into the small and near the river, as we washed the dust from our skin and ate warm bread and sweet fruit, as we lay down on soft mats, the sound of the city still drifting in through the open windows, we let ourselves rest. For the first time in many nights, we did not need the stories to carry us into sleep. The stories were all around us now, alive in the city, in the voices outside, in the soft splash of the river against the banks, in the lantern light that flickered across the ceiling, in the promise of tomorrow's market. Baghdad was here, and so were we. And for that moment, On that first night in Baghdad, the long road of dreams and dust felt worth every step. Chapter 2. The Golden Gates of Baghdad. You have walked the long road westward. At first, it is only a shimmer, a wavering blur on the horizon, the light bending above the flatness of the earth, playing tricks on eyes tired from too many days staring into distance. We would squint, shielding our gaze with dusty hands, wondering if the mirage was only the reflection of the sun on another dune, another stretch of dry grass, another ripple of heat above the plains. But the shimmer would remain, even as we drew closer, even as the wind lifted and carried with it scents we had not smelled in many days. Water-green leaves, the sweetness of river mud warmed by the sun, the faint breath of flowering plants that grew near hidden streams. It was the scent of a city that had learned to bloom beside the river, of gardens hidden behind mud-brick walls, of life layered upon life under the watchful gaze of minarets. The camels felt it before we spoke it aloud, their heads lifted, nostrils flaring as they caught the scents carried on the breeze, their pace quickening, their ears turning forward as they could already hear the sounds waiting beyond the last bend in the road. Even the older merchants, who had learned to hide their hopes beneath quiet eyes, let a small smile appear, the lines around their mouths softening as they glanced toward the horizon. The road became busier, filled with others who, like us, had followed it westward. Other caravans, traders with carts piled high, pilgrims moving with slow, determined steps, shepherds guiding flocks that bleated softly as they walked, families leading donkeys burdened with all they owned, the wheels of their carts creaking gently over the packed earth. We exchanged nods, small greetings, the quiet acknowledgement of travelers who shared the same dust, the same sun, the same unspoken dreams. And then one morning, as dawn lifted its pale colors over the land, the shimmer became shapes. Domes rose first, curved and graceful, catching the early light and reflecting it in a soft glow of gold and pale blue. Slender minarets reached toward the sky, standing watch over the waking city, their outlines sharp against the soft brightness of morning. Between them, rooftops and walls appeared, layered like waves, the colors of sun-baked clay, of warm stone, of plaster that had been painted and repainted over the years in hues that softened under the desert light. The Tigris lay like a ribbon of silver, winding through the city, its surface catching the dawn in a dance of ripples, reflecting the domes and minarets in soft fragments that move with the current. Along its banks, trees clustered, their leaves stirring the breeze, the dark green of palms and fig trees promising shade and the taste of fruit, a reminder of gardens and water in a land where both were treasures. We paused then, letting the camels rest, letting ourselves breathe, letting our eyes take in the sight we had carried in our minds for so many days and nights. The city of stories, the city of gold, the city of scholars and poets, of merchants and craftsmen, of gardens and libraries, lay before us, no longer a promise whispered by the fire, but real, alive, waiting. As we moved closer, the sounds reached us, the low murmur of many voices, layered and constant, like the hush of a river beneath the chatter of birds at dawn, the distant bray of donkeys, the calls of merchants already setting up their stalls beyond the gates, the rhythmic knock of wooden pestles in stone mortars as women prepared spices for morning meals. Bells chimed softly from caravans ahead of us, blending with the voices and the music that felt alive, comforting, filled with the promise of warmth and trade. The sun climbed higher as we approached the gates. Its light turned the domes to brighter gold, the river to liquid brightness, the walls of the city to warm, welcoming colors. The breeze that met us carried the smell of smoke from small cook fires, the scent of bread baking in clay ovens, the sharper tang of roasting meat spiced with cumin and coriander, the sweetness of fruit warming in the morning light. Children ran near the road, barefoot, laughing, calling to each other, their voices bright and clear, as women watched them from under the shade of their veils, baskets balanced on their hips, their robes lifting slightly in the breeze. Men led donkeys laden with clay jars, their surfaces dusty and rough, the soft clink of jar against jar marking their steps. Others guided small carts, their wheels leaving lines in the earth that would soon be lost beneath the footsteps of many more. And then, the gates themselves rose before us. Tall, broad, carved with patterns that caught the light. The gates stood open, guarded by men in robes of pale cotton. turbans wrapped neatly around their heads, spears held upright but relaxed in hands that knew their duty but did not seek conflict. Their eyes moved over us, taking the camels, the packs tied with careful ropes, the dust on our robes, the lines of the road traced on our faces. They nodded, a silent welcome, a silent warning, a reminder that we were entering a city of many people, many stories, many rules. We stepped forward, the camels shifting, the bells on their harnesses giving a soft chime that seemed to echo off the walls, joined the sound of the city in a brief moment of music that made the breath catch in my chest. We stepped into Baghdad. Inside, the world changed. The streets were narrow but alive, filled with movement and color. Fabrics in every hue hung from awnings, catching the breeze, moving in ripples that reflected the light in flashes of color. Deep blues, bright reds, soft greens, yellows like the morning sun. Baskets overflow with spices, the colors rich and dark, the scents rising in ways that blended into a perfume of warmth and promise. Pepper, cinnamon, saffron, cloves, cumin. Voices filled the air, bargaining, calling, laughing, the soft of a conversation that was a heartbeat of the market. We smelled the sharp, sweet scent of fresh fruit, dates, figs, pomegranates split open to reveal their jewels of red. We saw bread, stacked in tall piles, steam still rising from their warm surfaces, the crusts golden, the scent so strong it made us realize how long it had been since we had tasted anything but the flat, dry bread of the road. Above it all, the minaret stood, the call to prayer rising softly, weaving into the voices, reminding us of the faith that lived in this city, of the prayers whispered before dawn, of the hope that traveled with every merchant who crossed the deserts and mountains to reach this place. Baghdad was alive. It was alive in the voices, in the scents, in the colors that moved like water over the stones of the streets. It was alive in the promise that the long road we had walked had led us somewhere worth the dust and the fear, worth the cracked lips and tired eyes, worth the dreams we carried with us like treasures hidden in our hearts. As we guided our camels through the streets, as we felt the warmth of the morning sun on our faces, as we breathed in the scent of cinnamon and river water, of warm bread and roasting lamb, we knew that we had arrived. The golden domes and minarets of Baghdad had shimmered on the horizon, promising everything we suffered for along the long road. Now, they stood above us, real and bright, promising stories, promising trade, promising fulfillment of dreams born beneath the cold stars of the desert, carried forward by the soft jingle of camel bells, waiting for us in the heart of the city of gold. If the gates of Baghdad welcomed us with the promise of rest and the river's cool breath, it was in the bazaars that we truly arrived. The roads narrowed into alleys lined with shops and stalls, shaded by awnings of striped cloth that rippled softly in the warm breeze. The sun fell in shifting patterns on the ground, dancing across stones smoothed by countless footsteps. Dust lifted with every step but settled again under the weight of so many people moving slowly, carefully, carrying baskets, leading donkeys, balancing jars on their shoulders, each one a thread in the living fabric of the bazaar. The air was thick with scents that layered upon each other. Spices warm and sharp, the sweetness of dates, the smokiness of roasting meat, the tang of leather, the floral note of rose water spilled from a small glass bottle, the earthy smell of fresh bread pulled from clay ovens. It was a perfume of abundance that caught in the throat and settled into the robes we wore, a scent we would carry with us long after we left the city. Voices rose and fell like gentle waves, never harsh, each carrying words of greeting, of bargaining, of praise for wares displayed under fluttering shade. Arabic blended with Persian, Turkic tongues with soft laughter, the occasional bright exclamation of children weaving between legs, carrying small baskets of figs or pomegranates, calling out prices in clear voices that slipped like birdsong into the warm air. There were baskets overflowing with saffron, the thin red threads bright against dark cloth, the scent rising as merchants lifted handfuls for buyers to examine, the color catching the light like small embers. There were mounds of cinnamon sticks, dark and curled, their woody fragrance thick and comforting, reminding us of warmth in the chill mornings before dawn. Nearby, a man ground black pepper in a small stone mortar, the cracking sound soft but steady, the air around him alive with the sharpness of the spice. We passed stalls where silks were unrolled, bolts of deep indigo, rich crimson, soft gold, and pale green catching the filtered sunlight, rippling as buyers touched them with careful fingers, testing the softness, watching the way the fabric caught the light and shimmered. The merchant spoke in calm voices, praising the dye, the weave, the skill of the loom, folding and unfolding the silks so that they moved like water over their arms. In the spaces between these stalls, coppersmiths worked with small hammers, tapping carefully on trays and bowls, each strike leaving a tiny dent that became part of a swirling pattern of vines and flowers. The metal glowed warm in the sun, the edges smooth, the curves catching the light with a softness that spoke of skill and patience. Nearby, a young apprentice polished a brass pitcher, turning it slowly in his hands, watching the reflection of the bazaar dance across its surface. There were bakers pulling flatbreads from the walls of ovens, the crusts golden, the air around them filled with the warmth of yeast and flour, the soft crackle of crust as the bread cooled in small piles on woven mats. The smell made us pause, made our mouths water, reminding us how long it had been since we had tasted bread warm from the oven, soft in the hand, sweet on the tongue. Everywhere there was movement, but it was not hurried. People moved with purpose but without haste, stopping to greet one another, to examine goods, to taste a piece of fruit offered by a vendor, to share a few quiet words before continuing on. The bazaar was alive, but it was not loud. It was filled with the soft hum of the city breathing. Near the heart of the market, under a large awning that moved gently in the breeze, scribes sat cross-legged, writing on sheets of parchment, their hands steady as they dipped reeds into ink, the letters flowing in graceful lines that curved and connected, marking agreements, recording transactions, sending messages to distant cities along the same roads we had traveled. Their faces were calm, their voices low, the scent of ink mixing with the scent of spices, the soft scratching of reeds on parchment, a quiet rhythm beneath the murmur of a market. Children watched the scribes with wide eyes, their hands clutching small coins, waiting for letters to be written, for words they could not yet form themselves to be shaped and sealed and sent to fathers, brothers, uncles in other cities on other roads. The scribes looked up and smiled, folding the letters with care, pressing wax with simple seals, handing the papers back with a nod that said the message would travel safely, carried by merchants, by caravans, by the winds that moved across the deserts. As we walked through the bazaar, the bells on our camels chimed softly, blending with the other sounds until they became part of the hum that wrapped around us. We felt the weight of the road slipping from our shoulders as we moved past stalls of dried fruit, of nuts piled high in baskets, of jars of honey that caught the light and held it, glowing softly like small suns on wooden shelves. The bazaar was where dreams were exchanged for coin, where the silk we had guarded across deserts and mountains found new owners who touched it with reverence, folding it carefully into baskets, weighing it on small brass scales, pressing coins into our hands, the metal cool against skin warmed by the sun. Each sale was quiet, a soft conversation, a nod, a shared smile, the rustle of fabric, the clink of coins, the murmur of gratitude spoken in many tongues. We saw travelers from distant lands, their robes different from ours, their faces marked by other roads, their voices carrying the sound of places we had only heard of in stories. Lands where the rain fell often, lands of thick forests, lands of high mountains and deep valleys. They moved through the bazaars we did, eyes wide, breathing in the scents, letting the sounds wrap around them, letting the colors settle into their memories. In the evening, as the sun softened and shadows grew long, lanterns were lit, hanging from ropes strung between stalls, their glow warm and flickering, turning the colors of the bazaar deeper, richer, the golds turning to amber, the reds to wine, the blues to the color of the deepening sky. The voices grew softer, the laughter lower, the last transactions completed in the glow of the lantern light. The scent of tea brewing drifted through the market, mingling with the last breaths of spice and smoke, promising rest, warmth, and stories shared under the lanterns as the stars began to appear above the domes and minarets. And in that moment, standing in the heart of the bazaar with the scent of cinnamon and warm bread in the air, the soft clink of coins still ringing in our hands, the glow of lanterns reflecting in the eyes of merchants and travelers alike, we understood that Baghdad's bazaars were the true golden heart of the city. They were the place where the road's hardships became a soft memory, where the fear of the desert was replaced by the gentle hush of trade, where the dreams of the road were given shape in bolts of silk, in baskets of saffron, in the warm glow of brass, in the taste of sweet dates. And as we left the market that evening, guiding the camels slowly through the lantern-lit streets, we felt a quiet peace settle into us, the kind that only comes when a journey has brought you to a place where you are meant to be. If the bazaars of Baghdad were the heart of trade, then the voices of scholars and poets were a quiet breath of its soul, moving to the shaded courtyards, drifting in the archways of libraries, echoing softly under the domes of mosques, carried by the breeze that lifted the scent of ink and old paper into the warm air. After the dust and sweat of the markets, I would sometimes walk along the narrow streets that curved away from the noise, following the soft sound of voices rising and falling in measured tones. There, in courtyards cooled by fountains and shaded by fig trees, men sat cross-legged on woven mats. Scrolls spread before them, the script flowing across the parchment like small rivers of black ink. They read aloud, their voices calm and steady. Each word clear, the Arabic beautiful even to ears still learning its music. The Persian verses soft and flowing, the Turkic words sharp but filled with rhythm. Around them, students sat in quiet circles, leaning forward, eyes fixed on the speaker, hands resting on knees, minds reaching to catch every word. Sometimes, the scholars paused, dipping their reed pens into small pots of ink, scratching notes into the margins of their scrolls, recording thoughts that might one day travel along the same roads we had walked, carried by other merchants, by travelers, by seekers of knowledge who believed that learning was a treasure worth crossing deserts to find. The House of Wisdom, they called it, a place where the world's knowledge was gathered, where books came from faraway lands, carried on the backs of camels, protected as carefully as the finest silk. Here, under the light of oil lamps, scholars translated texts from Greek, Syriac, Sanskrit, turning them into Arabic, so that their wisdom could flow like water into the minds of those ready to learn. In the evenings, when the heat softened and the shadows grew long, poets would gather in the tea houses near the river, where the lantern light danced on the water, and the breeze lifted the scent of sweet mint tea into the air. They would sit close, cups warm in their hands, voices low as they recited verses they composed, poems of love, of faith, of the beauty of a single rose blooming in a quiet garden, of the sorrow of parting when the road called once more. Their words moved through the air like the soft ripple of the Tigris against its banks, calm and clear, filled with images that opened in the mind like small lamps in the dark. They spoke of Baghdad as a jewel in the night, of its domes glowing under the moon, of the call to prayer rolling over the rooftops in the dawn, of the scent of saffron in the morning air, of the hush of the bazaars as the lanterns were lit, of the silence that fell over the city when the stars appeared. And those who listened would close their eyes, letting the words paint pictures in their minds, letting the poetry become part of their breath, part of the quiet peace that settled in the heart when the world was soft and the night was gentle. Sometimes merchants like myself would pause outside these gatherings, letting the voices drift toward us, letting the words soothe the fatigue of the day, reminding us that life was more than trade, that there was beauty in the breath of a verse, in the shape of a single letter written carefully on parchment, in the sharing of words between strangers who, for a moment, became companions under the same lantern light. The poets of Baghdad were not only men in flowing robes. They were also women who shared verses in quiet voices, their words carrying strength and grace, their poems speaking of gardens, of rivers, of the hidden thoughts of the heart, of the courage it took to live in a world that often demanded silence. Their words were like the scent of jasmine that bloomed at night, soft but impossible to ignore, a reminder that poetry belonged to all who had the courage to feel. And so in Baghdad, the scholars and poets wove themselves into the life of the city, their words moving with the wind through the alleys, slipping under the doors of shops, settling in the courtyards of inns where travelers sat with cups of tea, letting the verses ease the memory of long roads, letting the stories remind them that they, too, were part of a larger song. At dawn, the call to prayer would rise, rolling through the city like a soft wave, and the scholars would return to their scrolls, the poets to their verses, each word they spoke and wrote becoming part of Baghdad's breath, part of the soft hum that rose with the scent of bread baking in clay ovens, with the rustle of silk in the markets, with the gentle laughter of children chasing each other through the dusty streets. In the quiet moments, as I sat by the river, letting my feet rest in the cool water, I would remember the voices I had heard, the verses that had drifted into my mind, the calm discussions of scholars under the shade of fig trees, and I would feel that Baghdad was not only a place where silk was sold, where spices change hands, where gold passed from palm to palm, but also a place where the heart could find rest, where the mind could open, where the spirit could listen and grow. For in Baghdad, knowledge was traded like the finest spice, and poetry was shared like the warmest bread, and both were treasures that weighed nothing in the hand but everything in the soul. And as the stars appeared above the domes and minarets, reflecting softly in the slow-moving water of the Tigris, the voices of scholars and poets would become part of the night's hush, a gentle promise that even in a world of dust and trade, there was room for words that could bloom like flowers in the dark, lighting the mind and warming the heart, as softly and surely as dawn returning to the city of Baghdad. Baghdad was a city of stories, but as I walked its streets, I learned it was also a city of sharp contrasts. There were mornings when I would stand by the river, watching the sun rise over the Tigris, painting the domes of the mosques in gold, turning the minarets into slender spears of light. The air would be cool, carrying the scent of water and gardens hidden behind high walls, the soft hum of the waking city drifting across the river like a promise of peace. Then, as I turned away from the water, I would walk through streets that twisted and turned like narrow streams between the buildings, the ground dusty beneath my sandals, the air growing warmer as the sun climbed, and I would see Baghdad's layers unfold. Behind tall walls with gates carved in patterns of vines and stars, palaces stood in quiet splendor. The walls were painted in soft colors, the courtyards inside shaded by orange and pomegranate trees, fountains whispering into stone basins, the air inside cool even as the day burned outside. The breeze would carry the scent of roses over the walls, mingling with the aroma of bread baking in ovens, the laughter of children echoing softly from within. I could see the edges of gardens when a gate opened, the green of leaves brighter than any cloth in the market, the petals of flowers catching the light as they moved in the breeze. Servants moved quietly through these spaces, carrying trays of fruit, pitchers of cool water, their footsteps silent on smooth tiles. In these palaces, the merchants and scholars, the poets and the wealthy men of Baghdad found a different world, a world where the heat and dust of the streets were left outside, where knowledge was discussed under the shade of trees, where poems were recited in the evenings while lanterns flickered softly in the branches above. At night, the lanterns in these courtyards glowed like small stars, the laughter of guests rising softly into the darkness, the music of stringed instruments drifting over the walls, carried by the cool breeze that slipped through the gardens. In these moments, Baghdad felt like a city of peace and beauty, a place where the harshness of the road and the noise of the market were softened by the hush of water and fountains, and the calm of shadows moving gently across stone. But when I stepped back into the streets, I saw another Baghdad. There were children who slept on the dusty ground, curled near the walls of buildings, their arms wrapped around each other, their faces turned away from the early morning light. There were women who carried baskets heavier than they should, their eyes tired, their steps slow as they moved from the market back to small homes where the air was thick and hot, where the scent of cooking lentils and bread was mixed with the smell of smoke from small fires burning in clay stoves. The bazaars were alive with color and trade, but just beyond the stalls, the streets were narrow, the houses crowded close together, their walls patched with mud and straw, their doors simple pieces that were held in place by worn hinges. In these streets, the dust rose with every footstep, settling on the skin, sticking to the sweat that came with the heat of the day. The smell of saffron and cinnamon from the markets was replaced by the scent of smoke and sweat, of animals and earth, of water carried in clay jars that cooled the air only for a moment before it was warmed again by the sun. People moved slowly here, their eyes downcast, their voices low, the noise of the market replaced by the quiet sounds of daily struggle. In the evenings, as the lanterns in the palaces were lit, casting warm glows across the gardens, the streets grew dark, lit only by the flicker of small oil lamps placed in doorways, the shadows stretching long and thin across the ground. The laughter that rose in the gardens was replaced by the soft cries of children who woke in the night, by the low murmur of voices as families shared their simple meals, by the hush that fell over the streets when the wind stilled, leaving only the quiet breath of the city in the darkness. And yet, in these streets, there was a beauty that was different from the beauty of the palaces. It was a beauty of resilience, of lives lived with courage and patience, of small joys found in the warmth of bread shared at dawn, in the laughter of children playing with pebbles in the dust, and the coolness of water sipped slowly under the shade of a small awning. It was a beauty found in the prayers whispered at dawn, the voices rising softly in unison, filling the streets with calm that lasted even as the heat of the day returned. It was in the stories told by mothers to their children, stories of Baghdad's greatness, of the river that brought life to the city, of the gardens they dreamed of the hope that one day they too would walk in the shade of orange trees, hearing the soft laughter of water and fountains. Baghdad was a city of palaces and of streets, of wealth and poverty, of gardens hidden behind high walls, and of dust that settled into every crack of the earth. It was a city where the soft glow of lanterns in the courtyards was matched by the small lights flickering in the narrow alleys, where the poetry recited in gardens found echoes and the lullabies sung softly in darkened rooms, where the scent of roses over the palace walls was carried by the breeze into the streets, reminding those who lived there that beauty belonged to the city as a whole. As a merchant, I saw both Baghdad's. I sold silk to the wealthy who lived behind the tall walls, who touched the fabric with careful fingers, watching the light catch on the threads, who paid with coins that clinked softly into my hands. And I sold small scraps of cloth in the streets, pieces of color that brightened the simple robes of those who saved for weeks to buy a gift for a child or a small piece of beauty for themselves. I learned that the golden gates of Baghdad opened to many paths, and each path carried its own stories. The palaces were places of learning and poetry, of beauty and quiet thought, but the streets were places of strength, of hope that lived in the smallest corners, of laughter that rose even in the heat, of lives that were woven into the fabric of the city just as surely as the gardens and the domes. In the evenings, as I lay on the roof of the inn, the cool air of the night brushing against my face, I could hear the soft music rising from the gardens, blending with the quiet sounds of the streets below. The two Bagdads joining in the hush of the night, and in that hush, under the stars that watched over the city, I learned that Baghdad's greatness was not only in its palaces or its scholars, but also in its streets, in the people who walked them, in the dreams they carried, in the small lights they lit against the darkness, making the city glow softly under the endless sky. If Baghdad's golden dome shimmered by day, it was at night that the city felt closest to stories whispered along the roads we had walked, the stories we heard under the cold stars beside small fires, stories that promised wonders beyond the dunes, treasures hidden in caves, journeys across seas as dark as the desert sky. In the markets by day, the voices of merchants rose with prices and laughter, the scent of saffron and cinnamon drifting through the alleys, the silk catching the light as it rippled in the breeze. But as the sun lowered, the sky turning from gold to rose to the soft blue of evening, lanterns were lit one by one, their glow spilling across the stones, turning the streets into rivers of moving light. It was then that Baghdad felt like the pages of the Arabian Nights turning slowly around us. Under the lanterns, the market did not sleep. Storytellers found corners where small crowds gathered, their voices calm, pulling listeners into worlds that felt close enough to touch. They spoke of Sinbad, who sailed across seas filled with monsters and storms, who found islands where diamonds lay scattered on ground, who returned to Baghdad again and again, his pockets filled with treasures, his heart filled with stories that were worth more than gold. They spoke of Ali Baba, who heard the words that opened a cave of wonders, where gold coins lay in piles, where jewels sparkled in the torchlight, where treasures gathered by thieves waited in the darkness, and of how cleverness and courage could be greater than any sword. As they spoke, children leaned forward, eyes wide, mouths slightly open, their minds painting images of caves that opened with a whisper of treasures hidden just beyond the edges of the city, of the possibility that they, too, might one day discover a secret door that led to wonders. The lantern light flickered on the faces of listeners, on the brass trays laid out by merchants who stayed to sell sweet tea and dates, on the silk robes of travelers who paused to rest, the glow catching on coins as they passed from hand to hand, soft clinks that felt like small echoes of the treasures in the stories. By the river, where the Tigris moved slowly, carrying the reflection of the lanterns in ripples that broke and reformed, small boats drifted, the soft splash of oars mixing with the distant call of prayer that rolled over the rooftops. On these boats, people gathered in the evenings, listening to musicians play soft melodies, the notes rising like the scent of mint tea that drifted from small cups held in quiet hands. The breeze carried the music, the scent of tea, the low hum of conversations, the laughter of children, the hush of the city settling into the night. The river was wide, calm, and it felt as though it carried not only water but the stories of the city, the whispers of those who had come before, the promises of journeys yet to be taken, the dreams of those who listened to stories of Sinbad and Ali Baba. Sometimes, as I sat near the river's edge, the soft glow of lanterns around me, the coolness of the night brushing against skin still warm from the day, I would close my eyes and let the sounds of the city blend with the stories in my mind. The crackle of a small fire nearby became the sound of torches in a hidden cave. The splash of water against the bank became the sound of waves against the side of Sinbad's ship. The soft clink of coins became the treasure pouring from an open chest. Baghdad felt alive with these stories, as if the city itself remembered each word spoken by the storytellers, holding the echoes in its walls, in its gardens, in the shadows that moved across the stones under the lantern light. It was a city where the impossible felt close, where the dreams we carried on a long road found a place of rest, to breathe, to grow. In the quiet corners of bazaars, older men sat with small cups of tea, telling stories to those who would listen, their voices low, their eyes bright with the light of the lanterns, their words weaving images of magical carpets that flew over mountains, of rings that held the power to command the winds, of genies who granted wishes when gnawed, of cities hidden in the desert where fountains ran with rose water, where lanterns burned with light that never faded. And as they spoke, the listeners felt the boundaries between reality and story soften, felt the dust of the road slip away, felt the long nights under the stars become part of a larger tale. A tale where Baghdad was not only a city of markets and trade, but a city where the dreams of the road came alive in the glow of lanterns and the hush of the night. For travelers like me, who had crossed deserts with silk and spices, who had felt the cold of the mountains and the heat of the dunes, who had listened to the wind whisper promises in the darkness, the stories of Baghdad were more than tales to pass the time. They were reminders that we were part of something older, something that moved like the river, something that lived in the breath of each dawn and the hush of each dusk. Baghdad storytellers, with their calm voices and patient hands that gestured softly as they spoke, were keepers of this truth. They reminded us that wealth was not only in gold or in silk, but in the stories we carried, in the dreams we shared, in the quiet moments when the world slowed, and we allowed ourselves to listen. And so, as the lanterns burned low and the stars appeared above the domes, as the river moved softly under the moonlight, as the last stories of the night were told and the listeners drifted away, the echoes of the Arabian Nights remained, lingering in the warm air, carried by the breeze, slipping into dreams of those who slept in Baghdad, reminding them that they were part of the city where stories lived, where wonders were possible, where the breath of each night carried the promise of tales waiting to be told when the dawn returned. Baghdad, in the soft glow of lanterns and under the hush of the stars, became a city of stories, a city of whispers, a city of dreams, echoing with the tales of Sinbad's voyages, of Ali Baba's cave, of hidden treasures and silent wishes, reminding all who came that in this city, the road's end was only the beginning of another story. Chapter 3. The shadow of hardship on the Silk Road. For all the golden domes of Baghdad, the scent of saffron in the bazaars, and the soft glow of lanterns reflected on the Tigris, the roads leading to and from the city, reminded every merchant that dreams came at a cost. Beyond Baghdad's safety, with the gates closed softly behind us at dawn, the world returned to sand and silence, to dust that settled on eyelashes, to winds that hummed across empty plains where shadows moved in the darkness. They called it the road, but we knew it for what it was, a long breath of distance, a space between one city's glow and another's promise, a place where footsteps were counted and water rationed, where the creak of leather straps and the soft thud of camel feet were the only sound for miles. And in this hush, the fear of bandits became another companion, walking beside us in the silence, slipping into our thoughts as the stars appeared, cold and clear, above our campfires. We had heard stories before we left Baghdad. Every merchant, every caravan master, every guard leaning on a spear at the gates told tales in low voices, speaking of bandits who watched the roads, hidden beyond the dunes, waiting for the moon to rise before they struck, their horses silent in the sand, their blades catching the lantern light for a single breath before the darkness swallowed it again. They spoke of caravans found days later, the camels scattered, the goods stolen, the water skins cut open and left to spill their precious contents into dry earth, the sand stained dark in the dawn. They spoke of merchants who paid the road's price not in coins, but in fear, in whispers of prayers as they heard footsteps approaching in the dark, and the sharp breath taken before the blade was drawn. But it is one thing to hear stories in the safety of a lantern-lit room, and another to feel the fear settle in your chest as you guide your camel through the darkness, your ears straining for sounds that should not be there. The faint clink of metal, the soft snore of a horse hidden in the shadows, the hush that falls over the desert when something stirs just beyond the edge of the firelight. At night, we build our fires small, using only enough flame to heat water for tea, to warm our hands before pulling blankets tightly around us. We sat close to the camels, their warm bodies pressing against the cold air, the bells on their harnesses muffled with cloth so they would not ring, so they would not give away our place in the darkness. Each of us took turns staying awake. The watch passed quietly, a nod, a whispered word, the shifting of a blanket as one man rose and another lay down, trying to find rest on the cold ground. The man on watch would walk slowly around the camp, eyes adjusting to the moonlight, ears tuned to every sound, the wind against the dunes, the soft shifting of the camels, the crackle of the fire as it settled into embers. And always, there was the fear of bandits, moving like shadows over the dunes, wrapped in dark cloth, their faces hidden, their eyes sharp in the moonlight, their knives and swords ready, waiting for the moment when the caravan's guard faltered, when the watchman's eyes closed for just a breath too long. Sometimes we would hear them, a distant horse's snort, the shifting of sand under careful feet, the low whistle of a signal given in the dark. The camels would lift their heads, their ears turning, their bodies stiffening, as they sensed what we could not yet see. Our hands would close around the hilts of blades, the fear thickening in the cool air, the world narrowing to the ring of lantern light, to the shadows at its edges, to the silence that pressed against the ears. There were nights when nothing happened, when the sounds passed, when the dawn came slowly, the sky lightening to gray and then to pale blue, and we would let out the breath we had held, loosening our grip on the knives, looking at each other with small, relieved smiles that faded as we packed the camels, as we tied the ropes, as we began to walk again. But there were nights when the silence broke. The bandits would come in a rush, horses pounding the sand, blades flashing, voices shouting commands that split the night's hush like lightning across a dark sky. The camels would cry out, trying to rise, their bells ringing despite the cloth, the sound bright and sharp in the chaos. We would grab the ropes, trying to hold the animals, trying to keep the packs tied down, trying to protect the silk and spices we had carried so far, knowing that a single cut of blade could spill it all into the dust. The bandits moved with practiced skill, knowing where to strike, how to scatter a caravan, how to grab what was light and precious, how to disappear into the dunes before defense could be organized. Coins hidden in belts, small pouches of spices, bolts of silk tied to saddles. All could be taken in moments, leaving the merchants clutching what little remained, their eyes wide in the lantern light, their breaths ragged in the cold air. Sometimes, the bandits would take only what they needed, leaving the caravan alive, letting it continue on its way with fewer goods, fewer coins, but with lives intact. Other times, the stories we heard proved true, and the dawn found the sand marked by the price of the road, a silent testament to the danger that walked beside us under the moon. Yet we continued. We continued because Baghdad's markets waited, because the promise of gold and trade was stronger than fear, because the road was the only way we knew, because the stop was a surrender to the desert, to become another story told by firesides in cities far from the dunes. Each step we took beyond Baghdad was a step measured against the fear of bandits, a step that carried the memory of lanterns glowing on the Tigris, of children laughing in the markets, of the scent of bread and cinnamon in the morning air. It was a step that reminded us why we walked, why we guarded the silk tied to the camels, why we counted each sunrise as a victory. And in the quiet moments, as the wind whispered across the sand, as the stars moved slowly overhead, we found a strange peace in the fear, a rhythm in the careful steps, in the watchful eyes, in the soft breaths taken before dawn. We learned to live with the shadow of bandits in the desert, to respect it, to let it sharpen our senses, to let it remind us that the road's promise came with price, that every coin earned in Baghdad carried the weight of nights spent listening for footsteps in the darkness. For in the end, the fear of bandits became part of the road, part of the silence between the camel bells, part of the wind that moved across the dunes. It became a reminder that the Silk Road, though we did not call it that then, was not a path of dreams alone, but a path of hardship and risk, of courage tested by moonlight, of hope that flickered but did not fade, even in the darkest hours before dawn. Beyond the fear of bandits waiting in the darkness, there was another danger that moved with us on the long road. The storms that came without warning, sweeping across the desert, swallowing paths and footprints in a breath, leaving behind silence and confusion, reminding every merchant and traveler that the desert answered to no man's plans. We learned to watch the sky each dawn, reading the thin lines of clouds that sometimes gathered like soft brushstrokes across the pale blue. We felt the wind as it shifted, lifting grains of sand that kissed the skin before falling, a warning so gentle it was easy to dismiss if one was foolish, if one had not yet learned the lessons of the road. It might begin with a stillness, the air holding its breath, the heat pressing down until the sweat rolled down the back, soaking into robes, until even the camels grew restless, their ears twitching, their heads lifting to sniff the wind. The sky would shift, the blue fading into a dull, heavy color, the horizon becoming a blur, the light changing as if dusk had arrived too early, and with it came a silence that was deeper than the quiet of dawn. Then, on the edge of that silence, came the first breath of wind, stronger now, carrying the sharp scent of dust, moving over the dunes with a low hum that grew into a voice, rising into a roar that drowned out the soft jingle of camel bells, the creak of leather straps, the quiet murmur of travelers sharing water and bread. The sandstorm would come like a wall, a curtain of dust and wind that moved across the earth, hiding the sun, turning the day into a strange twilight, the air thick with grains of sand that stung the eyes, filled the mouth, slipped into the folds of cloth wrapped around the face. The wind would howl, lifting the sand and wave that rolled across the ground, reshaping the dunes in moments, turning familiar landmarks into strangers, hiding the tracks we had followed, erasing the careful footprints left behind by those who had gone before. We would press close to the camels, tying cloth around our faces, covering our eyes, leaning into the wind, speaking in low voices that were carried away before they could be heard. The camels would groan, kneeling down, folding their legs beneath them, pressing their bodies against the earth to escape the force of the wind, their eyes closing, their long lashes coated in dust. The air would grow cold under the storm shadow, the warmth of the sun replaced by the chill of the wind that found its way under robes, pressing against the skin, stealing the breath, turning the sweat to a cold film that clung to the body. The world would become small, a space of sand and wind, of the sound of grains hitting cloth and skin, of the soft cries of animals, of the whispers of prayers spoken under the breath. There was no path in a sandstorm. The road we followed, the trails marked by stones or the tracks of those before us, disappeared in the swirling dust, leaving us blind, moving in circles if we tried to walk, stumbling over rocks hidden by the sand, falling to our knees as the wind pushed against us with invisible hands. And so we learned to wait. We would gather close, pulling the camels into a small circle, pressing against each other for warmth and comfort, using the animals as shields against the worst of the wind, their bodies steady and strong even as the sand gathered in small drifts around their feet. We would close our eyes, pressing the cloth tighter around our faces, breathing slowly, feeling the sand move against the skin with each breath, tasting the dust on the tongue, letting the storm pass over us like a dark wave. Time moved strangely in the storm. Minutes felt like hours, the light shifting in the dust, the roar of the wind constant, unchanging, pressing into the ears until it became a part of the mind, a hum that blended with thoughts of fear, of prayers, of memories of cool water and calm mornings. We did not know how long the storms would last. Some passed in moments, others held the world in their breath for hours, for days, until we wondered if the sun still existed beyond the swirling darkness. And when the storm passed, it did so as suddenly as it came, the wind dropping to a whisper, the sand settling in a softness that faded into silence. The sky would appear again, pale and washed, the sun returned with a weak warmth that felt like a promise, the light falling on a world that had changed while we hid beneath blankets and cloth, while we held the ropes of the camels, while we waited with closed eyes and quiet hearts. The dunes would be different, their shapes new, the valleys filled, the peaks moved, the stones that marked the paths buried beneath fresh layers of sand. The road we had followed would be gone, leaving us standing in a world that looked like every other place in the desert, with no signs, no markers, no memory of the way forward. In those moments, we learned the meaning of lost paths. We would stand in the silence, letting the wind's last breath carry away the dust from our robes, letting the camels rise slowly, shaking the sand from their backs, looking around with tired eyes that search for signs, a distant mountain shape, a dry riverbed, a cluster of rocks, a single twisted tree that might have survived the storm. Sometimes we would send scouts, men who would climb the dunes, shading their eyes against the sun, looking for the broken line of the horizon that might guide us, for the faintest trace of tracks left by another caravan that had survived, that had continued, that might lead us back to the path we had lost. Other times, we would wait until the stars appeared, using their steady light to guide us, letting the constellations become our map, moving carefully in the cool breath of night, each step taken with caution, each mile measured against the promise of water and the memory of the road. The storms and lost paths were a reminder that the road we followed was not ours to command, that the desert was a living world with its own breath, its own voice, its own will. It could offer calm dawns and warm days, but it could also take away the ground beneath our feet, the road before our eyes, the hope in our hearts. And yet, even as we felt the fear of being lost, of wandering in circles, of thirst waiting beyond the next dune, we learned to trust the quiet after the storm, to believe in the return of the stars, to follow the slow steps of the camels that seem to know the desert better than any map, better than any guide. For in the end, the storms and the lost paths were part of the road's promise, part of the hardship we accepted when we left the safety of city gates, when we followed the dreams of gold and trade, when we carried silk across the sands, when we believed that somewhere beyond the dunes, Baghdad waited, or Samarkand waited, or another city of markets and gardens and stories waited. The storms reminded us that we were small beneath the sky, but they also taught us to endure, to rise after the wind fell silent, to find the path again, even if it was new, even if it was different, even if it led us onward, step by careful step, across the endless breadth of the desert. There was a day on the long road when I understood how thin the line was between hope and despair. It was not during a raid, nor during a storm, but on a morning when the sky was clear and the air was cool, when the dunes stretched quietly before us under a soft dawn, when everything seemed calm. That was the morning we lost a camel. It had walked with us in Samarkand, its feet pressing slow, patient tracks into the sand, its breath rising in small clouds on cold mornings, its soft groans blending with the creak of leather and the jingle of bells tied to its harness. It had carried silk, carefully packed and tied with rope, a burden heavy but familiar, a promise of coins waiting in bazaars of Baghdad, a hope of trade that had kept us walking through the heat of the day and the hush of the night. But that morning, as the dawn light turned the dunes from gray to gold, the camel stumbled, its legs folded beneath it, slow and heavy, the silk shifting on its back, the ropes pulling tight before falling loose as the animal sank to the ground, its breath coming in rough, shallow gasps. We stopped, the caravan pausing in the soft silence of dawn, the only sound a quiet hum of the wind across the sand. We tried to lift it, to ease the ropes, to pull the burdens free so it could stand again. We spoke to it softly, our voices calm, our hands gentle, calling it by the simple name we had given it, urging it to rise, to take one more step, to carry the road with us a little longer. But the camel's eyes, dark and soft, looked past us, seeing something far away or nothing at all. Its breath slowed, its body still under our hands, the warmth of it sinking into the cool air, leaving us kneeling beside it, our robes brushing against the sand, the dawn light turning brighter as we sat in silence. When a camel dies, it is as if a piece of the road dies with it. We removed the silk, folding it carefully, tying it to the other camels who shifted under the new weight, groaning softly, their eyes calm but wary, as if they understood the price of the road. We covered the animal with sand, letting the wind take the last grains from our hands, letting it rest where it had fallen, a silent mark on the endless dunes, a reminder that not everything we love could continue with us. The caravan moved on, leaving a small mound of sand behind, the bells of the remaining camels chiming softly, a song for the one we left, for the promise it had carried, for the burden it had shared. But the dying of a camel was not the only shadow that fell over us. There were days when the sun burned hot above us, the sky a hard, endless blue, the heat pressing down until sweat ran into our eyes, until the ground shimmered, until the breath felt heavy in the chest. We would walk with heads lowered, cloth wrapped around our faces, our feet sinking into hot sand, the horizon dancing in waves of heat, promising water that was never there. And as we walked, the water skins grew lighter. We counted each sip, each drop, each moment when the coolness touched our lips, letting it slide down our throats before swallowing, letting the relief linger before it disappeared, replaced by the thirst that lived in the mouth, in the mind, in the slow, heavy movements of our bodies. Each morning, we checked the skins, feeling their weight, shaking them gently to hear the soft slosh inside, counting how many days they would last, how many miles we could walk before the last drop fell onto a tongue too dry to taste it. There were wells, yes, marked on maps drawn in careful ink, described by merchants who had passed before, whispered about around fires as blessings waiting on the road. But sometimes the wells were dry, the stones at the bottom warm and empty, the rope scratching against the rock as the bucket was lowered and raised with nothing inside, the hope in our eyes turning to fear, to quiet acceptance, to the knowledge that the next well would have to be enough. We learned to share, to ration, to measure the water against the miles, to hold the skins against our chests and feel their weight, hoping it would last one more day, one more sunrise, one more cool morning before the heat returned. The camels felt it too, their steps slowed, their eyes dimming. Their soft groans turned to silence as they walked, their tongues moving over dry lips, their heads lowering as they searched the ground for something to chew, something to ease the hunger and thirst that pressed into them as it pressed into us. We watched them carefully, checking their breathing, the way they moved, the way they looked at us with eyes that asked for water, for rest, for a cool breeze that would not come until the sun fell and the cold of the desert returned. There were days when we found water, a small pool hidden behind rocks, a spring that trickled from the ground, clear and cold, tasting of life and hope. We would let the camels drink first, their mouths dipping into the water, the sound of their drinking like music in the quiet, the ripples spreading across the surface, the reflection of the sky breaking and reforming with each movement. Then we would drink, letting the water wash the dust from our throats, letting it cool the heat inside, letting it remind us why we continued, why we followed the road, why we carried silk across the sands, why we believed in the promise of Baghdad's markets, in the scent of saffron, in the soft glow of lanterns on the river. But there were days when the water was not found, when the skins emptied, when the thirst grew so deep it became part of our breath, part of our steps, part of the dreams we saw when we closed our eyes under the harsh sun. And in those days, we learned what it meant to walk with hope balanced against fear, with the memory of cool water heavy in the mind, with the knowledge that every step was a promise to ourselves, to the camels who trusted us, to the families waiting in distant cities, that we would find the next well, that we would see the next dawn, that we would walk until we could walk no more. The dying camels and the empty water skins were the shadows of the road, the price we paid for the promise of trade, for the dream of gold, for the scent of spices and bazaars, for the soft peace of Baghdad's gardens. They were the reminders that the Silk Road, though we did not call it that then, was not a path of comfort, but a path of endurance, of faith in each sunrise, of trust in each step, of courage in the hush of dawn and the silence of dusk. And as we walked, the bells on the camels chiming softly, the sand shifting under our feet, the sky wide above us, we carried the memory of what we had lost and the hope of what we would find, letting it guide us forward, letting it become the quiet strength in our breath, letting it shape the long road of dreams and dust. There is a silence on the road at night that feels deeper than the silence of the dunes at dawn, deeper even than the hush of prayer before sunrise, deeper than the stillness of a well in the cool breath of morning. It is the silence that comes when the fire is burned low, when the camels are settled in a circle, their bodies dark shapes against the sand, their breath rising in soft clouds under the pale gaze of the moon. In that silence, fear comes softly, like a whisper carried on the wind, like the soft rustle of sand shifting under the weight of something unseen. We had walked long enough to know the sounds of night. The sigh of wind as it moved over dunes, the creak of leather as a camel shifted its weight, the distant call of an animal that roamed under the stars. These were sounds we came to accept, sounds that told us the world was alive even in the darkness, sounds that became a part of the slow rhythm of the road. But there were other sounds too, a twig snapping in the darkness, a cough quickly stifled behind a hand, the faint clink of metal, too deliberate to be an accident, the shift of a shadow just beyond the reach of the firelight. In those moments, every breath felt careful, every movement measured, every whisper weighted with the fear we carry but try to hide. Around the fire, men spoke in low voices, telling stories not of treasures or spices, but of bandits who came at night, of travelers who vanished into the darkness, of caravans found days later with goods scattered, with camels wandering, with the sand covering what was left behind. They told of signals given under the cover of night, of lanterns snuffed out in a rush of wind, of blades that glinted for a heartbeat before the darkness swallowed them again. Each story was a whisper, a breath that moved around the circle, carried by the crackle of the last embers, the glow of the coals painting the listeners' faces in soft light, their eyes reflecting the flicker of the fire as they glanced over their shoulders into the darkness beyond. We try to laugh sometimes, to push the fear away with jokes, with quiet stories of foolish bandits defeated by clever merchants, of treasures hidden so well even thieves could not find them, of lucky escapes and narrow paths that led to safety. The laughter was soft, careful, dying quickly as the silence returned, as the wind moved across the dunes, as the shadows settled once more. At night, we slept lightly, if we slept at all. Hands rested on the hilts of knives hidden beneath blankets, eyes closed but ears open, listening for sound that did not belong, the footstep that came too close, the breath that was not from a camel or a companion. The fire was kept small, the light low, so that the darkness would hide us, so that the glow would not call out to the night, so that we would remain unnoticed under the wide, star-filled sky. We took turns keeping watch, moving quietly around the camp, checking the ropes tied to camels, feeling the coolness of night settle into sand, letting the eyes adjust the shadows, letting the stars guide the gaze to the horizon, where darkness met darkness, where anything could wait, where everything might wait. And sometimes, the fear came not from the threat of bandits alone, but from the desert itself, the fear that the water would run out before the next well was found, the fear that the maps we carried would prove false, the marks on the parchment leading us in circles, the fear that the winds would rise again, swallowing the path in a storm, hiding the way forward, leaving us lost under the harsh gaze of sun, the fear that the camels would collapse, that the silk would be left in the sand, that the spices would spill into the dust, that the promise of Baghdad's markets would slip from our grasp. Fear was in every whisper shared at night, every glance exchanged when a sound broke the silence, every careful breath taken when the darkness felt heavier than usual, when the moon seemed too bright, when the shadows seemed to move on their own. Yet, we learned to live with this fear. We learned to let it sharpen our senses, to let it keep us alert, to let it remind us that the road we followed was not meant to be easy, that the dreams we carried of gold and trade came with a price that was measured not only in coins, but in the weight of silence, in the watchfulness of the night, in the careful rationing of water, in the slow, deliberate steps taken each morning when the dawn returned, and in the quietest moments, when the fear was strongest, when the whispers around the fire spoke of danger, when the eyes of the camels glinted in the darkness, reflecting the last glow of the embers, we found a strange companionship in the fear. It was shared by all who walked the road, all who watched the stars with wary eyes, all who listened to the wind for signs of danger, all who woke before dawn to lead the camels onward, believing that the promise of Baghdad, of Samarkand, of the distant cities of gardens and lanterns was worth the risk, was worth the fear, was worth the stories whispered into the darkness. For in those whispers, fear and hope lived side by side. Each fear was matched by a promise that dawn would come, bringing light to chase away the shadows, a promise that the road would continue, leading us onward, a promise that the markets would welcome us with scents of saffron and bread, a promise that the coins would clink softly in the palm, reminding us why we walked, a promise that the road, though hard, was a path of dreams as much as it was a path of dust. And so, we let the fear move with us, a silent companion on the long road, a reminder that every step we took was an act of quiet courage, that every sunrise was a victory, that every whisper shared in the darkness was a small light pushing back against the night. For on the Silk Road, though we did not call it that then, fear was as much a part of the journey as the camel's soft bell, as the wind over the dunes, as the promise of Baghdad under lantern light. It was a shadow we carried, but it was also a teacher, reminding us to move carefully, to live fully, to believe in the dawn, even when the darkness felt endless. There is a moment on the long road when dreams begin to fade, not with a single gust of wind or a sudden storm, but with a slow, quiet erosion of hope under the weight of each step. Each dawn that rises over an unchanging horizon, each breath of dry air that carries the taste of dust into the mouth. When we left Samarkand, the dreams were bright and sharp, like the glint of new coins in a hand, like the scent of silk fresh from the loom, like the stories of Baghdad told by merchants who returned with smiles and heavy pouches. We walked with our heads high, eyes bright, the bells on the camels chiming softly as we spoke of the spices we would sell, the silk that would ripple in the markets, the gold that would weigh down our robes as we returned. But the road was long, and dreams are not immune to the dust that settles on the skin, to the weight of the sun pressing down day after day, to the cold that creeps into the bones each night as the stars wheel overhead in silent judgment. There were mornings when we woke to the sound of the wind, the sand whispering across the dunes, the light turning from gray to pale gold, and felt the tiredness in our limbs, the stiffness that did not leave even after we stretched, the hunger that bread alone could not satisfy, the thirst that water could only quiet, never erase. There were days when the horizon never changed, when each step felt like the last, when the dunes rolled on forever, when the sky was empty of clouds, when the heat shimmered in waves that made the world blur and dance, hiding the distance in a cool mirage that promised water where there was none. And in those days, the dream of Baghdad's gold felt distant. The memory of the markets, of the scent of saffron rising in warm air, of the cool shade under the awnings, of the laughter of children chasing each other between stalls, of the coins that dropped with soft clink into waiting hands. These became stories we told ourselves to keep walking, stories that sometimes felt too bright, too far away, too fragile to hold on to when the thirst was deep and the road felt endless. At night, around the small fires, the stories changed. The tales of Sinbad's voyages across dark seas, the treasures of Ali Baba's cave, the hidden wonders whispered by the wind, all became softer, quieter, their edges worn smooth by the reality of the sand beneath us, the cold air that wrapped around our blankets, the knowledge that the next dawn would bring another day of walking, another day of guarding the camels, another day of rationing water, another day of silence broken only by the creak of leather and the sigh of wind. The dreams we carried were not gone, but they were tired, like us, moving quietly in the back of the mind, appearing in moments when the breeze was cool, when the stars were bright, when the sound of the camel bells reminded us of the road's promise. But even as they faded, the dreams did not leave entirely. They remained in the small things, in the moment when we shared the last piece of bread, the warmth of it reminding us of the kitchens of home, in the sip of water that cooled the tongue, reminding us of rivers and wells and the promise of gardens, in the laughter that came unexpectedly when someone told a foolish joke, the sound rising into the night, breaking the hush with a moment of brightness, in the way the dawn light touched the dunes, turning them from dark shapes into golden waves that seemed, for a breath, beautiful enough to hold. The road took many things from us, our ease, our certainty, our comfort, but it could not take the quiet hope that lived even in the dust, even in the silence, even in the long, empty stretches where no signs marked the way. Sometimes, we found ourselves remembering the reason we walked. It was for the promise of coins in the markets, yes, but it was also for the stories we would carry back, for the silk that would ripple in the wind, for the spices that would scent the air, for the sight of Baghdad's domes catching the morning sun, for the lanterns reflected in the slow-moving river, for the knowledge that we had walked a long road and had seen the world beyond the walls of our homes. And so, even as the dreams faded, they became quieter, deeper, settling into the bones like the memory of warmth, like the hush of prayer, like the soft sound of water in a well. They became the reason we rose each morning, even when our bodies ached, even when the cold made us shiver, even when the heat made us close our eyes against the brightness of the day. They became the reason we lifted the ropes, tied the loads, led the camels onward, step after step, mile after mile, believing that the road, for all its hardship, was worth the walking. For in the end, the dreams that fade are not gone. They are transformed, shaped by the road, turned from bright promises into quiet certainties, from loud hopes into patient faith, from soft wishes into strong resolve. The Silk Road, though we did not call it that then, was a place where dreams were tested, where the stories of treasures and gold met the reality of sand and thirst, where the promise of wealth was weighed against the price of endurance. It was a place where we learned that even as dreams faded, they also became more real, more honest, more precious, because they were no longer illusions, but promises we carried across the dunes, across the cold nights, across the quiet, endless spaces. And when we finally saw the domes of Baghdad rise on the horizon again, when we smelled the scent of bread and spices, when we heard the soft hum of the markets, when we saw the river catching the lantern-lighted dusk, we knew that the dreams we had carried were alive, quiet but strong, waiting for us in the soft glow of the city, reminding us why we had walked, why we had endured, why we had believed in the promise of the road. For even when dreams fade, they do not disappear. They become part of us, like the dust on our robes, like the calluses on our hands, like the quiet smile that comes when we see the sunrise over the dunes, knowing that we are still walking, still breathing, still believing. And that is enough. Chapter 4. What remains when dreams fade? There comes a time, after the dust has settled on your robes, after your feet have memorized the stones of countless roads, after your eyes have seen domes catching the dawn and markets alive with voices, when you begin to understand the truth of wealth along the road. It comes and it goes, slipping through your fingers like water, like the fine sand that runs across the dunes in the morning breeze. When I first left Samarkand, I thought of wealth as gold coins heavy and warm in the palm, as bolts of silk shining in the sun, as pouches of saffron that perfumed the air even to the leather, as the sweet clink of coins dropping into waiting hands in the markets of Baghdad. And it is true that wealth can be these things. There were mornings in Baghdad when the markets opened with the scent of baking bread and roasting meat, when I laid out my silks under the awnings, letting the breeze lift the edges so they rippled like water, drawing buyers who touched the fabric with careful fingers, who weighed the saffron on small brass scales, who counted coins into my hands. The sound of metal on metal soft and satisfying. In those moments, wealth felt real. It was a promise fulfilled, the roads dust paid back in gold. The promise of return with stories and with profit, the glow of the markets reflecting in eyes tired but bright with hope. But wealth is heavy, and along the road, heavy things demand their price. There were taxes at the gates, paid to guards who examined the silk, who touched the spices, who looked at the camels and named the price that must be paid before the city's markets could be entered, before the river's cool breath could be felt, before the promise of trade could become real. The coins clinked into hands that did not trade, into pouches that did not travel, into the quiet demands of those who stood between us and the markets. There were bribes whispered under the hush of night, coins pressed into the palms of men who promised protection, who stood watch under the stars, who rode beside the caravan through places where the fear of bandits was more than a shadow, where the night's darkness was a cloak for dangers that moved on silent feet. The bribes were small at first, but they added up, coins slipping away in exchange for safety, for the promise of dawn without loss. There were the cost of the road itself, the leather that cracked and needed repair, the ropes that frayed on the way to the silk, the shoes that wore thin on the sharp stones, the water that had to be bought when the wells were dry, the food that was traded in small measures of spice and coin when the road stretched longer than planned. There were the wounds of the journey, blisters that opened and bled, cuts from sharp rocks, the sickness that came with water that tasted of metal, the fevers that burned in the cold of night, the medicine bought at high prices from healers who passed along the road, who offered herbs in small pouches, who took coins in exchange for hope. And so, wealth became a tide. It came into hands in Baghdad's markets, in Samarkand squares, in the small towns along the river where traders gathered under shade of trees. It came with a glow of satisfaction, with the promise of return, with the weight of gold in small pouches tied to belts, with the scent of spices packed carefully for the road. And then it went slipping away in taxes and bribes and payments for food and water, in the cost of shelter on cold nights, in the price of safety, in the quiet exchanges that kept the road moving, in the small kindnesses paid for with coins that felt lighter each time they left a hand. I watched as the wealth I had imagined became something different. It was no longer a promise of riches to be counted in the courtyard of home, no longer the dream of new robes, of gardens built with trade success, of lanterns lit with oil bought with the price of saffron and silk. It became a tool, a necessity, something that flowed in and out with the tide of the journey, Something that allowed the road to continue, that allowed each dawn to rise without fear, that allowed each step to be taken with the hope of another market, another sale, another trade. Sometimes I would sit at night, the stars cold above, the sand cool beneath, the soft breathing of camels surrounding me, and I would take out the small pouch of coins, letting the metal catch the moonlight, letting the sound of coins sliding against each other remind me of the promise I carried. And I would understand that wealth was not only in the coins, it was in the roads walked, in the stories gathered, in the faces remembered, in the sense of markets alive with voices, in the taste of cool water after a long day's walk, in the soft laughter shared around a small fire under the endless sky. Wealth was in the knowledge that we had endured, that we had walked through storms and fear, through hunger and thirst, through silence and song, that we had seen the sun rise over Baghdad's domes, that we had watched the lanterns reflect on the river, that we had felt the hush of dawn in a city alive with stories. And so, as the coins slipped away, as the wealth was spent and traded, as the pouches grew lighter with each mile, I learned to let it go, to let it become part of the road, to let it be what was meant to be, a way to continue, a way to return, a way to keep walking. For what remained when the dreams of wealth faded was the truth of the road itself. That we walked not only for gold, but for the dawn, for the stories, for quiet peace that came with each step taken under sky, for the knowledge that wealth, like the sand, could slip through the fingers, but the journey remained alive in the breath, in the memory, in the promise of another sunrise beyond the dunes. And in that promise, there was a wealth that no coin could measure. Long after the coins have been counted and spent, after the silk has been unrolled in the market and traded for spices and gold, after the last cup of tea has been sipped under a lantern in Baghdad, what remains is the road. It hums beneath your feet even when you stand still, whisper with the voice of shifting sand, the soft jingle of camel bells, the hush of dawn before the sun rises, the quiet prayer murmured as the stars fade from the sky. It is a song that continues long after the marketplace has gone silent, long after the lanterns have been extinguished, long after the city walls have disappeared behind you in the dust of your departure. There is something about the road that calls to those who have walked it. It is in the rhythm of the steps, the steady swaying of the camel, the creak of leather straps holding a load steady across miles of dunes and rocky passes, the soft sigh of wind that cools the sweat on your brow before the sun returns to heat the earth. It is in the sound of water filling a clay jar, in the soft laughter around a fire when the day's travel is ended, in the taste of warm bread shared before sleep, in the soft, comforting weight of tiredness in your limbs as you settle under a blanket beneath the stars. The road has a voice that is gentle and patient, reminding you to walk slowly, to measure your breath, to take one step at a time. It teaches you that haste is an illusion, that each sunrise will come when it is ready, that each mile will pass beneath your feet in its own time, that the journey is not in the destination alone, but in the moments that fill the space between leaving and arriving. In Baghdad, the road song was drowned for a while by the voices of the markets, the laughter in tea houses, the low murmur of scribes copying scrolls under the shade of fig trees, the calls of merchants praising the quality of their goods. But even in that busy hum, if you listened, you could hear it. The quiet promise of the road calling softly, reminding you that the journey was not over, that the world was wide, that there were other cities, other roads, other dawns waiting to be seen. At night, as I lay on the roof of an inn, letting the cool breeze of the river brush against my face, listening to faint hum of the city drifting upward, I could feel the road calling. It was there in the soft creak of a cart wheel turning in the distance, in the bark of a dog as it settled near a gate, in the rustle of a bird shifting in its nest. It was there in the breath of the wind that smelled of water and dust, carrying with it the scent of distant places waiting beyond the walls. And when we left Baghdad, when we tied the loads once more to camels, when we walked out to the gates into the cool light of dawn, the road song returned in full, filling the silence of the early morning with its steady rhythm, reminding us that we were part of something larger than the markets, larger than the gold we carried, larger even in the dreams that had led us here. It was Scheherazada's voice in the darkness, telling stories to keep the dawn away, telling stories to keep the darkness away, telling stories to keep the journey alive one night at a time. Each step on the road was a word in that story. Each mile a sentence, each sunrise a new chapter, each sunset a quiet pause before the next part began. The road song was in the stories we shared around the fire, Stories of storms survived, of wells found just as hope was fading, of markets where the silk sold well, of nights spent under lantern light in distant cities, of laughter shared with strangers who became friends, if only for a day, before the road called them in a different direction. It was in the stories of fear, too, of bandits who appeared in the darkness, of footsteps heard just beyond the firelight, of water skins emptied too soon, of camels who stumbled and did not rise, of maps that led us in circles, of the endless horizon that sometimes felt like a promise and sometimes like a curse. But even these stories became part of the song, part of the breath of the road, part of the reminder that to walk the world was to accept the risk of it, to accept the weight of each step, to find courage in the hush of the desert night, to believe in the promise of dawn even when the darkness seemed endless. The road song was patient. It did not rush you, did not demand haste, did not measure worth by the speed of your steps or the weight of your burdens. It measured worth by your willingness to continue, by your faith in the journey, by your ability to rise each morning and take one more step, to lift the rope, to tie the load, to breathe the cool air before the heat returned, to let the dust settle on your robes and still walk forward. And it taught you to listen to the wind, to the silence, to the breath of your companions, to the soft groans of the camels, to the quiet voice inside that reminded you of why you walked. It taught you to watch the sky for signs, to read the dunes, to follow the stars when the paths disappeared, to trust that the world would reveal itself one step at a time. When the wealth faded, when the gold was spent, when the markets were behind you, when the dreams became quieter, what remained was the song of the road. And it was enough. For in that song was a reminder that the world was wide and beautiful, that each horizon led to another, that each dawn was a promise renewed, that each step was a choice to continue, that each breath was a prayer of gratitude for the chance to walk, to see, to learn, to live. In the end, the road became part of us. As we became part of it, our footsteps joined the countless others who would walk before, who would walk after, who would hear the same song in the hush of dawn, in the sigh of the wind, in the quiet rhythm of a journey that never truly ends. For the eternal song of the road is the song of life itself, reminding us that even as dreams fade, even as gold slips away, even as cities are left behind, the journey continues. And in that journey, there's a beauty that no wealth can buy, a peace that no fear can steal, a promise that is renewed with each sunrise, each horizon, each quiet, patient step forward. If the road was a teacher of patience, then the bazaars of Baghdad were teachers of humility. I remember the first day I walked through the markets, the dawn light still soft as the merchants lifted the awnings, shaking the dust from the woven cloth, tying ropes to hold them in place as the breeze moved through, bringing with it the scent of river water and warm earth. The camels had been led to a quiet corner, their loads untied, the silk carefully unfolded, bolts of color rippling in the morning air as the sun rose higher. There was a feeling then, a quiet pride, a hope that all the hardship of the road would find its reward in the soft clink of coins, in the quick glances of buyers admiring the dye, the weave, the shimmer of the silk under brightening sky. And so it was, for a time, coins dropped into open hands. The scales tipped as saffron was weighed. The spices lifted to the nose, their fragrance tested, their quality discussed in low, thoughtful voices before price was agreed upon, palms pressed together in quiet acknowledgement of the trade. But the bazaars were not only places of trade. They were places of stories, of lessons wrapped in the soft folds of conversation, of knowledge traded as easily as silk, of humility taught in small, quiet moments that slipped beneath the noise of bargaining and laughter. I saw men dressed in robes dyed with the brightest colors, who walked with the confidence of wealth, paused before a small stall where an old woman sold dates and figs, her goods arranged in careful rows on a simple cloth. I watched as they listened to her quiet words, as they accepted the fruit she offered to taste, as they nodded and pressed coins into her hand, coins that meant little to them but meant much to her, coins that were accepted with gratitude and a soft blessing spoken into the air. I saw a scribe, his fingers stained with ink, pause at a stall selling small lamps, turning one over in his hands, examining the workmanship, the careful shaping of the clay, the way the light would glow through the thin walls when a wick was placed inside. The merchant, a young man with nervous eyes, watched the scribe with hope, and when the scribe nodded and paid, the young man's shoulders eased, his eyes brightening with the quiet pride of work recognized. There were lessons in these moments. Lessons that wealth was not measured only in gold, that trade was not measured only in profit, that worth was found in the way one treated those with less, in the way a smile was offered, in the way a blessing was received, in the way the smallest transaction could carry respect, kindness, and dignity. The bazaars taught that patience was a currency. There were days when the silk did not sell, when buyers passed with only a glance, when the spices remained in their jars, the scents rising with the heat but finding no takers. There were days when the coins came slowly one by one, when the hope carried from the road flickered in the dust of the market, when the promise of wealth fell fragile under the weight of the midday sun. And on those days, the bazaars taught the lesson of waiting, waiting for the right buyer, the right moment, the right word spoken softly, the right smile exchanged, waiting with faith that the day would end with enough, that the road's hardships were not in vain, that the dawn would come again and with it another chance, another market day, another opportunity to unfold the silk, to weigh the saffron, to share the stories carried across the sands. The bazaars taught that knowledge was a treasure worth more than gold. I listened as merchants from distant lands spoke of roads I had not traveled, of cities I had not seen, of markets where other goods were traded, of the prices of spices in lands where the air smelled of rain, of the fabrics woven in valleys where rivers moved fast and clear. Each conversation was a lesson, each story a map drawn in words, each shared experience a lantern lighting the way toward understanding. It was in the bazaars that I learned to listen more than I spoke, to observe the way people moved, the way eyes shifted when price was too high, the way a hand lingered on a piece of silk that was truly wanted, the way a pause in speech meant hesitation that could be softened with kindness, with a lower price, with a shared laugh. The bazaars taught that humility was a companion to wisdom. There were days when I thought my goods were the finest quality, that they would sell for high prices, that the trade would be easy, and then an old merchant would pass, touching the silk with practiced fingers, lifting a small section to the light, turning it, feeling its weight, before setting it down with a gentle shake of his head, offering a lower price that reflected a flaw I had not seen, a weakness in the weave, a dye that was not as rich as I believed. In those moments, pride could sting, but the lesson was clear. To learn, to see, to accept that even on the long road, there was still more to understand, more to improve, more to respect in the quiet knowledge of those who had walked these roads longer, who had seen more markets, who had traded in the bazaars of many cities, who had learned to see value and truth with clear eyes. And above all, the bazaars taught that life was not only trade but community. At dusk, when the lanterns were lit, when the stalls were packed away, when the camels were led back to the courtyards, the merchants would gather in the tea houses, sharing cups of sweet tea, letting the warmth ease the tiredness in the limbs, letting the laughter ease the weariness of the day. Stories were shared, not of prophets alone, but of families waiting at home, of children who would one day walk these markets, of dreams that were held quietly in the heart, of roads still to be traveled, of sunrises still to be seen. In the glow of lanterns, in the hush of the evening, the lessons of the bazaars became clear. That wealth was fleeting, but kindness remained. That pride could blind, but humility could guide. That haste could cost, but patience could reward. That trade was not only goods exchanged, but respect given. That the road, for all its hardships, was worth walking because it led to these places of laughter, of learning, of human connection. And when the lanterns were extinguished, when the bazaars fell silent under the watchful eyes of the stars, when the soft hush of the night returned, these lessons remained, carried quietly in the heart, ready to guide the next dawn, the next trade, the next step on the road. There is a hush that comes over the caravan after a long day's walk, when the sun has slipped below the dunes, leaving the sky painted in soft hues of rose and purple, when the last glow of light fades and the first stars appear one by one, like small lanterns above the darkening sands. In that hush, as the camels are settled in a circle, their bodies warm in the cooling air, as the small fire is coaxed to life with careful hands, the first sparks rising into the dusk, there's a moment when the road feels far away, when the day's weariness falls gently from tired shoulders, when the stories return. They come softly, at first, in the voice of the wind that sighs across the dunes, in the crackle of the fire as it eats the dry wood, in the gentle rustle robes as men shift to find a comfortable place to sit. They slip into the silence, like water into dry earth, filling the quiet with promise, with memory, with dreams that faded during the harsh heat of the day, but now return under the stars. And so, by the fire, the whispers of the Arabian Nights find their way into the night. Someone begins, clearing their throats softly, looking into flames as if reading the story there, letting the sparks guide the words, letting the shadows dance with the tales. They speak of Sinbad, the sailor who braved seas as dark as the desert sky, who faced storms that tossed his ship like a leaf on the water, who found islands where diamonds lay in the sand, who met strange creatures and survived trials that seemed impossible, returning again and again to Baghdad, to the city of lanterns, with treasures and tales that made the listeners believe in the impossible. As the voice drifts into the night, the listeners close their eyes, letting the images form the mind. The creaking of the ship's wooden beams, the salt spray on the skin, the roar waves under a storm-dark sky, the sudden calm on an island at dawn, the glitter of jewels under a rising sun, the soft call of seabirds as Sinbad sails home. Then, the voice changes and another begins, telling of Ali Baba, who discovered the cave of the 40 thieves, hidden behind a boulder that opened with a whispered phrase, revealing treasures beyond imagination. Gold coins, silver dishes, jewels that sparkle in the torchlight, silks folded in neat piles, spices that scented the air even in the darkness. The story unfolds, the firelight flickering over the listeners' faces, casting shadows that move like the thieves in the tale, like the hidden treasures that call from the darkness. In that moment, under the stars, on the soft breath of the desert wind, the hardships of the road fade. The thirst, the tiredness in the legs, the soreness in the shoulders from carrying loads, the fear of bandits, the hunger that gnaws quietly, all soften, replaced by the wonder in the stories, by the reminder that the world is filled with mystery, with magic, with hope that lives even in the hardest places. Sometimes, the stories are softer, quieter, tales of love and loss, of gardens hidden behind high walls where roses bloom under the moon, of poets who write verses so beautiful they make sultans weep, of wise women who use their cleverness to save their families, of small acts of kindness that change the course of lives. These stories drift into the night like the scent of the tea brewed in small cups, like the smoke that rises and disappears into the darkness. Around the fire, heads nod, smiles appear, eyes glisten in the light as memories surface. Memories of mothers telling stories before sleep, of fathers reciting poems during long winter nights, of friends sharing laughter in the markets of distant cities, of the dreams that led each person to the road in the first place. And when the stories pause, the silence that follows is soft, gentle, filled with the quiet breathing of the camels, the distant sound of the wind moving over the dunes, the faint rustle of sand shifting as the night cools further. Sometimes someone sings, their voice low, carrying a melody that matches the softness of the night, a song of longing for home, of hope for safe passage, of gratitude for the small fire that warms tired hands, for the companions who share the journey, for the stars that watch silently, faithfully, as the road continues. The whispers of the Arabian Nights remind the travelers that stories are as necessary as water on the road, that they are a different kind of nourishment, feeding the spirit, reminding the heart to keep dreaming, reminding the mind to see beyond the horizon, to believe in treasures hidden not only in caves, but in the kindness of strangers, in the courage found in the smallest acts, in the beauty of the world that unfolds step by step, mile by mile. For the stories are not only entertainment to pass the hours before sleep. They are a way of surviving the harshness of the road, a way of remembering that beyond the dunes lies Baghdad, with its lanterns reflected in the river, with its gardens scented with jasmine, with its markets alive with colors, with its people who carry stories of their own. And so, as the fire burns low, as the last embers glow like small jewels in the sand, as the voices grow softer, as sleep begins to pull the listeners into dreams, the stories linger in the cool air, blending with the hush of the desert, becoming part of the night, part of the breath, part of the quiet promise that tomorrow, the road will continue, and with it, the stories will continue too. For as long as there's a road to walk, there will be stories to tell, whispers of Arabian Nights shared by the fire, carrying hope, wonder, and comfort across the sands, lighting the darkness with a soft glow of dreams that do not die, but live in the hearts of those who continue to walk, one dawn at a time. There comes a moment on the long road when you realize that peace is not something waiting at the end of the journey, but something that walks quietly beside you, step by step, sunrise by sunrise, breath by breath. At first, it is easy to believe that peace will arrive when the markets are reached, when the silk is sold, when the gold coins are counted into the palm, when the warm bread of the city is tasted after weeks of dry rations on the road. It is easy to imagine that peace will be found in the gardens of Baghdad, under the lanterns reflected in the slow-moving river, in the laughter that rises in the bazaars at dawn. But the road teaches differently. Peace, I learned, is in the slow sway of the camel as it moves across the sand, its feet pressing quiet prints into the earth, its breath steady in the cool air of dawn. It is in the soft jingle of the bells tied to its harness, a song so gentle it blends with the wind, with the hush of the desert, with the rhythm of your own heartbeat as you walk beside it. It is in the dawn itself, in the first pale light that touches the dunes, turning them from dark shapes into waves of gold, in the chill that brushes against your skin before the warmth of the sun returns, in the silence that holds the world for a moment before the day's noises begin. It is in the small tasks repeated each day, the tying of ropes around the loads, the folding of blankets, the checking of water skins, the quiet nods exchanged with fellow travelers, the small smiles that say, "We continue." These acts, simple and steady, become a ritual that calms the mind, reminding you that the journey is built not on great leaps, but on many small, patient steps. Peace is found in the night, too, under the cold gaze of the stars, when the fire is burned low and the coals glow softly in the sand, when the voices around the fire are quieted, when the wind moves over the dunes like a careful breath, when you lay on your back and let your eyes follow the constellations that have guided countless travelers before you. There is a deep comfort in knowing that the stars you see are the same stars that watched over the caravans of the past, over the traders and poets, over the merchants who carried stories and silk, over the camels who rested after long days, their bodies warm against the cold of the night. Peace is found in the moment of laughter that rises unexpectedly, even in hardship. A joke shared while tightening a rope, a shared glance when a camel snorts and shakes its head, a small story told as tea is poured into clay cups, the steam rising like a soft promise into cool air. It is found in the taste of water after a long, hot day, when the liquid cools your mouth, reminding you of wells and rivers, of gardens hidden behind walls, of the small kindnesses of the world. It is found in the bite of warm bread, in the sweetness of a date shared under the awning of a small market, in the fragrance of saffron that clings to your fingers after weighing it for a buyer. Peace is in the acceptance of the road's silence, in the acceptance of its dangers, its hardships, its unpredictable nature. It is in learning to listen to the wind, to read the sky for signs of storms, to trust the camels when they pause, sensing something unseen. It is an understanding that the road will not always be kind, but that it is honest, and that each challenge is a teacher, shaping the spirit with patience and humility. The road teaches you to walk slowly, to match your breath to the rhythm of your steps, to find comfort in the simplicity of movement, in the act of continuing even when the dunes seem endless, even when the horizon does not change, even when the sun burned hot on your shoulders. There is a deep, quiet peace in the realization that you do not need to rush, that each step is enough, that each dawn is a blessing, that each sunset is a soft close of the day, a moment to rest, to reflect, to be grateful for the distance traveled. It is found in the knowledge that wealth fades, that dreams change shape, that plans bend under the weight of reality, but that the journey itself remains, alive and constant, a companion that asks only that you keep walking, that you keep breathing, that you keep believing in the promise of the next sunrise. Sometimes, peace comes in the form of stories shared around a fire. Stories of Sinbad's adventures across dark seas, of Ali Baba's treasures hidden in caves, of poets who found beauty in the simplest of things, of travelers who returned home with nothing but stories and found they were richer for them. These stories remind you that the world is wider than your fears, that there are wonders hidden in the most unexpected places, that hope can survive the harshest deserts, that kindness can be found even in the hardest moments, that joy can rise like the dawn after the longest night. And when you finally return to the city, when you stand in the markets once more, when you hear the hum of trade, when you smell the bread baking and the spices warming in the morning air, when you see the lanterns reflected in the river at dusk, you understand that the peace you found on the road does not leave you. It stays in your breath, in the slow, steady beat of your heart, in the calm way you move through the market, in the quiet gratitude that lives in your chest as you count your coins, as you sip your tea, as you listen to laughter at children chasing each other under the awnings. You realize that the peace you sought was never only in the destination, but in the journey that carried you there, in the steps taken, in the miles crossed, in the stories gathered, in the lessons learned, in the moment of quiet joy found in the smallest of things. For in the end, what remains when dreams fade is the peace that comes from knowing you have walked the road, that you have lived fully, that you have seen the sunrise over the dunes, that you have shared stories under the stars, that you have found beauty in the hardship, hope in the silence, and peace in the journey itself. And that is enough. Conclusion. In the hush that comes after the road ends, a quiet regret lingers like the last glow of a dying fire. We chase the promise of Baghdad's golden gates, the scent of saffron in crowded bazaars, the clink of coins that fell heavy with dreams. We walked with visions of silk rippling in the desert breeze, of lanterns reflected on the Tigris, of wealth that would change everything. But wealth slips away, as does youth, as do dreams whispered under the cold stars. The Arabian Nights we carried were stories that felt close enough to touch, filled with hidden treasures and wonder, yet they remained just beyond reach, half dream, half illusion, dissolving like a mirage when we try to hold them. Baghdad, with its poets and palaces, its gardens and markets, became a memory gilded with longing, a chapter closed in the hush of dawn. The road remains, but the dreams fade, leaving behind a tender ache for what could have been, for the riches we believed would save us, for the stories we believed would make us whole. We walked, and we hoped, and in the end, we learned that some dreams are meant to remain dreams. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And now, good night.